My neighbor pounded on my door at 4 in the morning looking absolutely terrified. He was clutching a hard drive to his chest, his hands shaking violently as he looked over his shoulder. He told me not to go to work today, and to absolutely avoid logging into the company network under any circumstances. When I demanded an explanation, he just stared at me with wide, panicked eyes and whispered that I would understand by noon. At 10:30, I received a phone call that changed my entire life, making me realize my own family had perfectly framed me for a 20-year federal prison sentence. I am Rachel, 33 years old, and a senior forensic auditor at Vanguard Logistics. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had your trust completely weaponized against you by the exact people who were supposed to protect you. The pounding on my apartment door started exactly at 4 in the morning. It was not a polite knock or a casual tap. It was a frantic, aggressive hammering that vibrated through the walls of my quiet Chicago apartment and jolted me awake from a deep sleep. My heart slammed against my ribs as I sat up in the dark, disoriented and confused. Living alone in the city, an unexpected visitor at that hour usually meant a fire, an emergency, or danger. I threw off my heavy duvet, my bare feet hitting the cold hardwood floor, and grabbed the heavy brass flashlight I kept on my nightstand just in case. I crept down the hallway, the aggressive knocking echoing through the silent space again. I pressed my eye against the peephole, my hand gripping the flashlight tight. Standing in the dimly lit corridor was David. David was my neighbor from down the hall. He was a 40-year-old cybersecurity specialist who also happened to work at Vanguard Logistics, the same massive supply chain corporation where I was employed. David was the definition of an unassuming, quiet professional. In the 2 years we had been neighbors, our interactions had never gone beyond polite nods in the elevator or brief comments about the weather while checking our mailboxes. He was always neatly dressed, always calm, and always kept to himself. But the man standing on the other side of my door right now looked completely unrecognizable. I undid the deadbolt and pulled the door open just enough to look at him. David was drenched in sweat despite the chilly autumn air circulating in the hallway. His usually neatly combed hair was a disheveled mess, and his eyes darted nervously up and down the corridor as if he expected someone to jump out from the shadows. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under a wrinkled gray hoodie, and his knuckles were white as he clutched a small black external hard drive tight against his chest. Before I could even ask what was wrong, he pushed his way slightly closer to the door. Crack, his voice dropping to a frantic, raspy whisper. Rachel, you cannot go to work today. Do not go into the office. Do not turn on your company laptop. Do not log into the Vanguard network. Just trust me. I stood there, staring at him, my highly rational auditor brain struggling to process the sheer panic radiating from a man I barely knew. In my profession, everything operates on logic, evidence, and clear procedures. I deal with multi-million-dollar discrepancies, corporate compliance, and strict financial regulations. Spontaneous, cryptic warnings at 4 in the morning simply did not compute. David, what on earth are you talking about? I asked, keeping my voice low but firm, trying to inject some reason into the bizarre situation. It is 4 in the morning. Are you in some kind of trouble? I have end-of-quarter compliance reports due on the director desk by 9. I have to log in today. It is non-negotiable. His eyes widened further and he shook his head violently, his breathing becoming even more erratic. He looked absolutely terrified, a kind of primal fear that you cannot fake. No, you do not understand, he pleaded, his voice trembling as he took a half-step back into the hallway. If you log in, it triggers everything. They are going to lock it all down. They are watching the network traffic right now. Please, Rachel, for your own sake, act like you are sick. Turn off your router. Do not touch anything connected to Vanguard. My patience was wearing thin, replaced by a rising tide of genuine alarm. I pushed the door open a little wider. David, who is they? What is going to happen? You cannot just wake me up in the middle of the night, tell me to abandon my job, and refuse to give me a single fact. I am an auditor. I need facts. Tell me what is going on right now. He clutched the hard drive tighter, his knuckles practically glowing white under the harsh fluorescent hallway lights. He looked at me with an expression that was a disturbing mixture of profound pity and absolute terror. I cannot say anything else right now, he whispered, his voice cracking slightly. It is too dangerous. Just trust me, Rachel. Stay offline. You will understand by noon. Without another word, he turned and practically sprinted down the hallway. I heard the heavy door of his apartment slam shut, followed by the distinct sound of 3 separate deadbolts sliding into place. I stood alone in my doorway, the cold hallway air wrapping around my shoulders. I slowly pulled my door shut, turning the lock with a heavy thud that seemed to echo endlessly through my living room. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping city, but an eerie, heavy stillness that felt pregnant with impending disaster. I walked into my kitchen and turned on the small light above the stove, needing some kind of illumination to dispel the creeping dread settling in my stomach. The digital clock on the microwave glared back at me in bright green numbers, 4:15. My work laptop sat on the kitchen island, a sleek silver machine that suddenly looked like a ticking time bomb. My fingers twitched with the overwhelming urge to open it. My job was my entire life. I had sacrificed my 20s, my social life, and my peace of mind to climb the corporate ladder at Vanguard. My family especially, my arrogant father Richard, and my narcissistic mother Catherine, constantly demanded excellence while simultaneously treating me like a failure who could never measure up to my older sister Vanessa. Vanguard was my proof that I was capable. The thought of deliberately missing a major quarterly deadline went against every professional instinct I possessed. I stared at the laptop. All I had to do was lift the lid, enter my credentials, and check the server traffic. Just one quick look to see if David was having some kind of paranoid breakdown, or if something was actually wrong. But the sheer terror in his eyes held me back. David was a cybersecurity expert. He saw the invisible digital threads that ran the entire corporation. If he was terrified enough to pound on my door in the middle of the night, breaking 2 years of polite, neighborly silence, something catastrophic was in motion. I backed away from the kitchen island, feeling a cold sweat break out along my spine. I walked over to my media console and yanked the power cord from my wireless router directly out of the wall socket. The blinking lights on the device died instantly, plunging the apartment back into total digital isolation. I sat down on my living room sofa, pulling my knees to my chest. Outside my floor-to-ceiling windows, the city of Chicago was still wrapped in darkness, a sea of amber streetlights and deep shadows. The distant wail of a police siren echoed through the concrete canyons, a sound I usually ignored, but tonight it made me flinch. The anxiety was a physical weight crushing my chest. I watched the clock on the wall, the second hand sweeping around in a slow, agonizing circle. 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock. The sun finally began to rise, casting a pale grayish-blue light over the city, but the illumination brought no comfort. The apartment remained tomb quiet. My phone sat completely silent on the coffee table, a stark contrast to the usual morning barrage of corporate emails and demanding family group chat messages. The silence was not peaceful. It was the terrifying calm before a devastating storm, and all I could do was sit in the deafening quiet, watching the clock tick closer to noon, waiting for my entire world to explode. 8 o'clock came and went without a single notification pinging on my phone. The morning light filtering through my blinds shifted from a cold gray to a harsh, blinding white, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air of my living room. I abandoned the sofa and began pacing the length of my hardwood floors, my bare feet tracing the exact same worn path between the kitchen island and the media console. I made a pot of black coffee, pouring a cup I had absolutely no intention of drinking, just to give my shaking hands something warm to hold. My personal cell phone sat on the quartz countertop, mocking me with its blank, dark screen. I unlocked it for the 20th time, navigating straight to the family group chat. Nothing. There was not a single message since yesterday afternoon. Under normal circumstances, this specific text thread was a relentless, exhausting barrage of my older sister demanding attention. By this time, on a typical Friday morning, Vanessa would have already flooded the chat with pictures of her overpriced matcha lattes, her post-workout mirror selfies from her private gym, and lengthy complaints about how exhausted she was from managing her non-existent schedule. She held a vanity director title at Vanguard Logistics, a completely hollow position my father created specifically so she could collect a massive executive salary while contributing zero actual work to the corporation. Following Vanessa's usual morning barrage, her husband Jamal would inevitably chime in. Jamal was a razor-sharp corporate defense attorney, a powerful and highly connected African-American man who loved nothing more than reminding everyone in the family exactly how brilliant he was. He usually texted about his morning golf rounds with judges or dropped subtle, condescending remarks about how many billable hours he had already logged before breakfast. Then my mother Catherine would send a flurry of messages complaining about the hired help at their Lake Forest estate, while my father Richard barked demands about weekend itineraries and corporate deliverables. But today the thread was a barren wasteland. The last message was a mundane text I had sent yesterday at 5 in the evening, confirming I would finish the quarterly audit by this morning, read by all four of them, responded to by no one. As a forensic auditor, I was extensively trained to look for anomalies to spot the missing gaps in the data where people desperately tried to hide their sins. In my family, silence was the ultimate anomaly. My parents and my sister were loud, deeply narcissistic people who thrived on taking up space and demanding a captive audience. They simply did not do silence unless they were actively coordinating a narrative. They only went completely dark when they were closing ranks, aligning their stories, and deciding exactly who was going to take the fall for whatever massive mess they had just created. I leaned against my kitchen counter, wrapping my fingers tighter around the cooling coffee mug, and looked around my apartment. It was a modest 800 square feet in a decent building, furnished with practical pieces I had hunted down at estate sales and restored myself. It was clean, efficient, and entirely mine. Every single mortgage payment, every utility bill, and every piece of furniture had been paid for by my own grueling 60-hour work weeks, analyzing spreadsheets and tracking corporate funds. Yet if you asked my mother or father, they would eagerly tell a completely different story to anyone at their elite country club willing to listen. They absolutely loved to play the roles of the benevolent, long-suffering parents dealing with a troubled, ungrateful daughter. I could almost hear Catherine's glossy voice echoing in my head, telling her wealthy socialite friends how much I was constantly struggling, how I desperately needed their guidance, how they practically had to buy this apartment for me just to keep me off the streets. The actual truth was that I had needed a financial cosigner for the mortgage 5 years ago, because my student loan debt was so astronomically high. It was a crushing debt I only carried because Richard flatly refused to pay for my state college tuition while simultaneously fully funding Vanessa's luxurious Ivy League lifestyle without a second thought. They co-signed my mortgage to maintain a permanent financial leash on me, a heavy chain they used to spin their endless narrative of my supposed incompetence. I set the mug down with a sharp clink against the stone counter. The silence from the Lake Forest estate was not just suspicious, it was weaponized. They knew I was scheduled to submit the final compliance logs this morning. Richard always texted at 7 sharp on audit days to aggressively pressure me into finishing early. The terrifying fact that he was quiet meant he either did not care about the multi-million-dollar audit anymore, or he already knew the audit was never going to happen. 9 o'clock struck. This was the exact hour when the Vanguard corporate offices officially opened for business. My phone remained entirely dead. There were no automated alerts from the secure server, no calendar reminders popping up on my screen, no frantic emails from the accounting department asking for my final approvals. I walked over to the window, pressing my forehead against the cool glass, watching the city traffic crawl along the busy avenue down below. The hard knot in my stomach twisted tighter, wrapping around my lungs, until every breath I took felt shallow and forced. David's terrified, sweating face flashed in my mind again, warning me not to touch anything. I aggressively fought the urge to open the corporate laptop still sitting on the island. 10 o'clock passed in a blur of nervous pacing and chewing on the inside of my cheek. The absolute lack of digital communication from a major logistics company that employed thousands of people was physically nauseating. It was as if Vanguard Logistics had simply ceased to exist overnight, wiped completely off the grid. I stared at my personal phone, willing it to give me a sign, a clue, a sloppy mistake from Vanessa, anything to break the agonizing suspense that was tearing my nerves apart. Then, at exactly 10:30, the suffocating dead silence of my apartment was finally shattered. My cell phone vibrated violently against the quartz countertop, the sudden loud buzzing making me jump backward in shock. I grabbed it instantly, fully expecting to see my father demanding to know why my reports were not filed. Instead, an entirely unfamiliar out-of-state phone number glowed brightly on the screen. I stared at the glowing screen of my cell phone as the unfamiliar 10-digit number pulsed rhythmically in the palm of my hand. The area code was out of state, specifically from the Washington, D.C. region. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Every instinct I had honed over the past decade in corporate finance screamed at me to let it go to voicemail to maintain my absolute isolation. But the suffocating dread building in my chest forced my thumb to swipe across the green accept button. I brought the phone to my ear, not saying a word, barely daring to breathe. For 2 agonizing seconds, there was only the sharp crackle of static and the sound of heavy, panicked breathing on the other end. "Rachel," a voice whispered. It was a man speaking so fast and so quietly that I had to press the speaker tightly against my ear to catch his words. I did not recognize the voice, but the sheer terror lacing his tone was unmistakable. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice tight and guarded. "That does not matter," the man replied breathlessly. "Listen to me very carefully. Vanguard Logistics has been completely locked down. Federal agents are swarming the main lobby, the executive suites, and the server rooms. They are securing every terminal and confiscating every hard drive. The elevators are disabled. The security doors are bolted shut. No one goes in and absolutely no one goes out." Before I could ask a single question, before I could demand to know who was calling, or how he got my personal cell phone number, the line went completely dead with a sharp click. I slowly lowered the phone, the blood draining rapidly from my face until my skin felt as cold as ice. The air in my apartment suddenly felt thick and unbreathable. A lockdown. Federal agents in the server rooms. No one going in or out. The sheer magnitude of those words crashed over me with the devastating force of a tidal wave. I was the senior forensic auditor for Vanguard Logistics. My entire job, my professional existence revolved around finding financial discrepancies and ensuring strict regulatory compliance for a multi-billion-dollar supply chain corporation. But more importantly, I was the final gatekeeper. I was the one who signed off on the quarterly financial disclosures. My digital signature, my credentials, and my professional seal were stamped on the bottom line of the exact documents the federal government would be seizing right this very second. Panic, raw and unfiltered, seized my throat. If Vanguard Logistics was going down for something massive enough to warrant a coordinated federal raid, the authorities would immediately look at the money trail. And the person tasked with monitoring that money trail was me. If the corporate funds were tainted, if there was systemic fraud or massive money laundering happening through our shipping ports, the investigators would not just assume I missed it. They would assume I was actively covering it up. They would assume I was complicit. My knees felt weak and I gripped the edge of the quartz countertop to keep myself from collapsing to the floor. The deafening silence from my family suddenly made perfect, horrifying sense. Richard, Catherine, Vanessa, and Jamal were not just ignoring me because they were busy coordinating a corporate crisis. They were ignoring me because I was the crisis plan. I was the designated scapegoat. They had built an elaborate multi-million-dollar house of cards, and they had positioned me standing directly underneath it, right before pulling the final support beam. I turned my head and locked eyes with my Silver Company laptop, still sitting exactly where I had left it on the kitchen island. It sat there like a loaded weapon. My mind raced through 1,000 terrifying scenarios, calculating the exact level of exposure my signature carried on those documents. I needed to know what they had done. I needed to see the ledgers, the offshore accounts, the dummy corporations my father must have hidden deep within the supply chain manifests. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to reconnect my wireless router, boot up the machine, launch the encrypted virtual private network, and dive straight into the Vanguard servers. I was a brilliant forensic accountant. If they had manipulated the numbers to frame me, I could find the digital breadcrumbs. I could trace the unauthorized transactions and print the proof I needed to save myself before the federal agents knocked down my door. I took a step toward the kitchen island, then another. I reached out, my trembling fingertips hovering just an inch above the cold aluminum lid of the laptop. Then the frantic, terrified voice of my neighbor David echoed violently in my head. If you log in, it triggers everything. They are watching the network traffic right now. My hand stopped midair. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the breath completely out of my lungs. If I logged in right now, I would be connecting to the Vanguard servers at the exact moment a federal raid was taking place. My IP address, pinging from my personal apartment during a massive corporate lockdown, would not look like an innocent auditor trying to check her work. It would look exactly like a guilty, desperate criminal frantically trying to delete evidence or finalize a massive wire transfer before the authorities could shut down the system. David had not just been warning me to take a sick day. He had been warning me that the trap was set, spring-loaded, and waiting for me to step directly onto the trigger. If I turned on that laptop, I would be handing the federal government the exact digital proof my family needed to finalize my frame-up. Jamal, with his ruthless legal mind, would have orchestrated it perfectly. He would have ensured that the final, most damning transactions required my specific credentials timed perfectly for when I usually submitted my Friday morning reports. I snatched my hand back from the laptop as if the metal had suddenly turned red hot. I took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing the blind panic back down into my chest and replacing it with the cold, calculating logic that made me exceptional at my job. I could not fight them on their turf. I could not run blindly into the digital minefield they had laid out for me. I had to do the hardest thing possible in a moment of absolute crisis. I had to do absolutely nothing. I turned my back on the laptop, wrapping my arms around my waist, and began to pace the floor once again. I was alone, isolated in my apartment, caught in the terrifying crosshairs of a federal investigation and a vicious family betrayal. The clock on the wall ticked forward, moving relentlessly toward 11:15 in the morning. I knew with absolute chilling certainty that the silence from Lake Forest was about to break, and when it did, the real nightmare would begin. At exactly 11:15, the suffocating quiet of my living room was shattered. My personal cell phone resting on the kitchen counter next to the unplugged router began to vibrate. The screen illuminated, casting a harsh white glare across the dark quartz surface. The caller ID displayed a single word: Mother. I stared at the name for 3 long rings. This was the moment. The coordinated radio silence was officially over. I took a deep, steadying breath, forced my heart rate to slow down, and tapped the screen to accept the call. I brought the receiver to my ear but remained completely silent, letting her speak first. Rachel, get to the Lake Forest house immediately. Catherine's voice was sharp, breathless, and laced with a frantic, trembling energy. But beneath the surface panic, I could detect the cold, calculated edge that my mother always employed when she was directing a narrative. She did not ask if I was okay. She did not ask if I had heard the news about the federal raid at Vanguard Logistics. She went straight for the jugular. You have ruined us, she hissed, her voice vibrating with venom. Do you understand what you have done? You have destroyed this family. Do not speak to anyone. Do not answer any phone calls from your office. Do not contact your colleagues. Get in your car and drive here right now. We are waiting for you. The line went dead with a sharp click before I could even part my lips to reply. She did not want an answer. She wanted obedience. I slowly lowered the phone, staring at the darkened screen. The sheer audacity of her words settled over me like a heavy winter coat. You have ruined us. It was a masterful piece of psychological manipulation. She was already establishing the baseline for the tribunal I was about to face. They were going to paint themselves as the devastated, blindsided victims of a rogue employee who just happened to be their own flesh and blood. They needed me isolated, panicked, and rushing into their controlled environment where they could corner me. I turned my gaze back to the silver company laptop sitting on the island. Leaving it there felt deeply unnatural, like leaving a loaded gun on a playground. But taking it with me would give Jamal the physical hardware he needed to complete whatever digital framing he had orchestrated. I grabbed my car keys, my personal phone, and my heavy wool coat. I did not take a single piece of corporate property. Walking down the quiet hallway of my apartment building, every step felt heavy. The elevator ride down to the parking garage was agonizingly slow. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting long, sickly shadows across the concrete pillars as I walked to my car. It was a sensible, reliable sedan I had purchased myself 5 years ago, completely paid off without a single cent of Vanguard money. It stood in stark contrast to the fleet of imported luxury vehicles sitting in my parents' driveway. I slid into the driver's seat, the cold leather sending a shiver down my spine. I started the engine and pulled out of the dark garage into the chaotic mid-morning traffic of downtown Chicago. The drive ahead of me was roughly 45 minutes, a straight shot north up the highway toward the aggressively wealthy enclaves of the North Shore. As the towering skyscrapers of the city began to fade in my rearview mirror, giving way to the sprawling suburban highways, my mind went into overdrive. I was no longer just a daughter answering a frantic call from her mother. I was a senior forensic auditor, actively entering a hostile crime scene. I gripped the steering wheel, forcing my knuckles to relax. I had to anticipate their every move. Richard, my father, would play the role of the enraged patriarch. He would use his booming voice and physical presence to try and intimidate me into submission. He had built Vanguard from the ground up, and he viewed every employee, including his own children, as disposable assets. Vanessa, my older sister, would undoubtedly be hysterical. She was the golden child, the protected heir to a fortune she never worked a day to earn. She would weaponize her tears, screaming about how my supposed crimes were going to traumatize her perfect children and ruin her flawless reputation at the country club. But the real threat was Jamal. My brother-in-law was a corporate defense attorney who specialized in making wealthy criminals look like innocent victims of circumstance. Jamal was a predator in a tailored suit. He would have the fake evidence lined up. He would have the legal jargon ready to confuse and paralyze me. He would present me with a choice that looked like a lifeline but was actually a noose. The highway transitioned into the winding, heavily wooded roads of Lake Forest. The modest suburban homes gave way to towering wrought iron gates, long sweeping driveways, and hidden mansions nestled behind ancient oak trees. This was a world built on exclusion and extreme wealth. It was a world that required constant, massive influxes of cash to maintain. The multi-million-dollar renovations, the private jet memberships, the lavish charity galas. I had audited enough companies to know that lifestyles like theirs, when paired with declining legitimate shipping revenues, almost always pointed to offshore accounts and illegal capital. I turned my turn signal on and approached the massive stone pillars marking the entrance to my parents' estate. The heavy iron gates were already swung wide open, waiting to swallow me whole. As my tires crunched against the pristine gravel of the long, winding driveway, the sprawling Tudor-style mansion came into view. It was a monument to their greed. Perfectly manicured hedges lined the walkway. A massive stone fountain gurgled in the center of the circular driveway. Parked in a neat, intimidating row near the front entrance were Richard's black Mercedes, Vanessa's white Range Rover, and Jamal's sleek Porsche. They were all inside. The entire syndicate was gathered in the living room, waiting to sacrifice their scapegoat. I put the car in park and turned off the engine. The silence inside the cabin of my car was deafening. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic warning rhythm urging me to put the car in reverse and drive as fast and as far away as possible. But running would only prove their fabricated narrative. Running would make me look guilty. I took one final deep breath of the cold air circulating in the car. I reached for the door handle. I was not the scared, eager-to-please daughter they thought they were summoning. I was the auditor who knew exactly how to track their stolen millions. and I was going to tear their pristine, perfect world apart from the inside out. I stepped out of my sedan, the sharp crunch of the gravel beneath my boots breaking the suffocating stillness of the estate. The massive front doors were made of solid hand-carved oak, standing tall like the entrance to a fortress. I slid my key into the heavy brass lock, a lingering privilege of being Richard and Catherine's daughter, and pushed the door open. The air inside the Lake Forest mansion was perfectly climate-controlled, smelling faintly of expensive lemon and basil wax, mixed with the overwhelming scent of fresh white lilies arranged in massive porcelain vases. Every inch of the grand foyer screamed of unfathomable wealth. My boots stepped off the marble entryway and sank into a hand-woven Persian rug that likely cost more than my entire annual salary. Above me, a massive tiered crystal chandelier caught the late morning sunlight, scattering 1,000 tiny rainbows across the deeply polished mahogany walls. For years I had walked into this house and felt nothing but a crushing sense of inadequacy. I had looked at the imported Italian leather sofas, the custom velvet draperies cascading from 12-foot windows, and the curated collections of modern art, believing that my parents had earned every single luxury through sheer brilliance and tireless entrepreneurship. But today the opulence did not make me feel small. It made me feel violently ill. Looking at the glittering chandelier, I did not see success. I saw offshore accounts. I saw fabricated vendor invoices and ghost shipments moving through Vanguard Logistics. I saw millions of dollars siphoned from legitimate corporate channels to fund Catherine's aggressive social climbing and Richard's insatiable ego. They had stolen this life. They had built a palace of glass and gold using money they had illegally scrubbed through the very company I was hired to audit. And now they intended to use my blood to pay the final bill. I unbuttoned my wool coat and walked slowly down the long corridor toward the formal living room. I did not announce my presence. I let the heavy, rhythmic thud of my boots echo against the hardwood floors, signaling my arrival. When I rounded the corner and stepped through the arched double doors, I found them waiting. They were positioned across the massive room like a firing squad ready to execute a traitor. My father, Richard, stood perfectly rigid by the towering marble fireplace. He was wearing a cashmere sweater and dark slacks swirling amber liquid in a heavy crystal glass, despite it not even being 11 in the morning. His jaw was set, his broad shoulders squared, radiating the arrogant, untouchable authority of a patriarch who firmly believed he owned everyone in his orbit. Catherine, my mother, sat rigidly on the edge of a cream-colored silk sofa. Her posture was razor straight, her face a mask of manufactured tragedy. She dabbed at the corner of her dry eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the devastated matriarch to absolute perfection, though her gaze locked onto me with the predatory sharpness of a hawk spotting prey. Sprawled elegantly on the matching love seat was Vanessa. My 36-year-old sister wore a designer cashmere loungewear set, one leg crossed over the other, furiously tapping her perfectly manicured fingernails against her knee. As the undisputed golden child of the family, Vanessa had never faced a single consequence in her entire life. She held a fake executive title at Vanguard, collected a massive paycheck, and spent her days shopping and lunching. Seeing her now pretending to be inconvenienced by a federal raid made my jaw clench. But the most dangerous person in the room was not my father, my mother, or my sister. It was the man standing calmly by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the pristine lake, Jamal. Jamal was Vanessa's husband, and he was a shark wrapped in bespoke Italian wool. A brilliant, highly connected African-American corporate defense attorney, Jamal made his living finding legal loopholes for billionaires who thought they were above the law. He was ruthlessly intelligent, slick, and completely devoid of moral hesitation. While Richard operated on ego and Catherine operated on social manipulation, Jamal operated on cold, hard strategy. He was the family fixer, the man Richard called whenever the corporate ledgers required aggressive legal shielding. He turned away from the window as I entered, his sharp, dark eyes scanning me from head to toe, assessing my threat level like a prosecutor sizing up a hostile witness. The tension in the grand living room was absolutely suffocating. The air felt thick, charged with a heavy toxic energy that made the hairs on my arms stand up. No one moved. No one offered a greeting. The silence stretched out heavy and oppressive, designed entirely to intimidate me, to make me feel small and isolated before the real attack began. In the past, I would have immediately broken the silence. I would have nervously asked what was wrong, practically begging for their approval and guidance. I would have played right into their hands, exposing my vulnerability and handing them the psychological high ground. Not today. I stopped a few feet inside the room, keeping a safe distance from all of them. I did not take off my coat. I did not offer a polite smile. I simply stood there, my posture perfectly straight, my expression an unreadable mask of absolute calm, and stared right back at my father. I let the silence drag out, forcing them to endure the awkwardness, forcing them to realize that the obedient, anxious daughter they had summoned was no longer standing in front of them. Richard slammed his crystal glass down onto the mantel. The sharp, violent clink shattered the quiet of the room. He took a step toward me, his face flushing with a terrifying, righteous anger that he usually reserved for insubordinate employees. "You finally decided to show up," Richard bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "I hope you are proud of yourself, Rachel. I hope you are absolutely thrilled. The federal government has locked down my company, and it is entirely because of your spectacular incompetence." Catherine let out a dramatic, trembling sob from the sofa, burying her face in her hands. "How could you do this to us, Rachel? After everything your father and I have sacrificed to build a legacy for this family, you have brought the FBI to our doorstep. You have completely ruined us." I did not flinch. I did not rush to comfort her. I kept my eyes locked on Richard. Vanessa uncrossed her legs and leaned forward, her face twisting into an ugly sneer. "You are so stupid, Rachel. You always have been. You walk in here looking like you have done nothing wrong while our entire world is burning down." I opened my mouth to respond, to finally strike back, but Jamal raised a single, elegantly manicured hand. The gesture was small, but it commanded absolute silence in the room. Even Richard stopped glaring and looked at his son-in-law. Jamal slowly walked toward the center of the room, stopping directly in front of the heavy glass coffee table. His footsteps were completely silent on the thick Persian rug. He did not yell. He did not look angry. He looked perfectly, terrifyingly calm, which made him infinitely more dangerous than Richard. "Let us not waste time on emotional outbursts," Jamal said, his deep, resonant voice slicing through the heavy tension in the room. "Anger is not going to solve the massive federal problem currently sitting in our laps. We need to focus on facts, liability, and damage control." He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick manila dossier. He tossed it onto the glass coffee table with a heavy, definitive thud that sounded entirely like a judge banging a gavel. "Take a seat, Rachel," Jamal commanded, gesturing to a lone leather armchair positioned directly across from the sofa. "We have a lot of extremely unpleasant evidence to go over, and you are going to listen to every single word I say." I looked at the dossier, then at the armchair. It was a classic interrogation tactic, placing the suspect in a lower, isolated position while the interrogators towered above them. They wanted me cornered. They wanted me breaking down in tears, begging Jamal to use his legal brilliance to save me from the feds. I did not sit down. I kept my hands casually in my coat pockets and looked Jamal dead in the eye. "I prefer to stand," I said, my voice steady and cold. "Tell me exactly why I am here, Jamal, and skip the theatrics." Jamal did not blink. His dark eyes locked onto mine with the predatory stillness of a reptile waiting for its prey to bleed out. He slowly unbuttoned his suit jacket, projecting an aura of total unbothered control, and rested his hands on the glass coffee table, leaning over the manila dossier. "You want to skip the theatrics?" Rachel, Jamal asked, his voice a low, smooth baritone that echoed off the marble fireplace. "Fine. Let us talk strictly about the facts. As of 8 o'clock this morning, Vanguard Logistics is the target of a coordinated raid by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Internal Revenue Service. They have locked down the corporate campus. They have seized the servers. They have frozen the corporate accounts." He paused, letting the sheer weight of those federal agencies hang in the suffocating air of the living room. They are executing a federal warrant for massive systemic international wire fraud and money laundering. Jamal continued, tapping a manicured finger against the dossier. We are talking about tens of millions of dollars funneled through dummy corporations, ghost shipments moving through our ports in Southeast Asia, and illegal capital scrubbed clean through our domestic supply chain. It is a textbook racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations case. A RICO charge. The kind of charge that carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. I kept my face perfectly still, betraying absolutely no emotion, even as my heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I knew about the ghost shipments. I knew about the offshore shell companies. I had known for over a year. What I did not know was exactly how they planned to pin a corporate conspiracy of this magnitude on a mid-level forensic auditor. Jamal straightened his posture, slipping his hands into his trouser pockets. The federal government does not conduct a raid of this scale without a primary suspect already in their crosshairs, Rachel. They do not tear apart a Fortune 500 company unless they have a clear paper trail pointing directly to the architect of the fraud. And let me guess, I replied, keeping my voice deadpan and flat. You are going to tell me that the architect is me. Before Jamal could even answer, Vanessa erupted from the love seat like a coiled spring snapping loose. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She lunged forward, pointing a trembling manicured finger directly at my face. You were the auditor! Vanessa screamed, her shrill voice shattering the calculated calmness Jamal had tried to establish. You signed the third-quarter compliance reports. You personally authorized the financial disclosures. You are trying to destroy my inheritance because you have always been completely insanely jealous of me. The sheer absurdity of her accusation was staggering. The federal government was currently dismantling our father's empire. Armed agents were seizing corporate hard drives, and my older sister was entirely consumed by how this impacted her personal bank account and her fragile ego. In Vanessa's deeply narcissistic reality, a multi-million-dollar federal money laundering investigation was simply a petty revenge plot I had orchestrated because I was jealous of her designer lifestyle. You have always hated me, Vanessa shrieked, taking another aggressive step toward me. Ever since we were kids, you sat in your miserable little room, stewing in your own bitterness, resenting the fact that Dad actually loves me. You could never stand the fact that I am successful, that I have a beautiful family, that I married a brilliant man like Jamal. So you cooked up this ridiculous financial disaster to tear down the company. You deliberately falsified those audits to drag my name through the mud and steal the money that belongs to my children. I stared at her, genuinely marveling at the depth of her delusion. Vanessa had never worked a single grueling day in her life. Her so-called success consisted of showing up to the Vanguard office twice a month to drink sparkling water and online shop from her corner office. Yet she stood there screaming at the top of her lungs, genuinely believing that I had risked a federal prison sentence just to spite her. Vanessa, calm down, Catherine scolded, though her tone lacked any real reprimand. My mother stood up from the sofa, moving to put a protective arm around her golden child. Catherine glared at me with a look of profound disgust, playing her role in the psychological warfare perfectly. Look at what you are doing to your sister, Catherine hissed, her voice dripping with venom. Look at the stress you are causing this family. We knew you were troubled, Rachel. We knew you harbored deep-seated resentment toward us, but we never imagined you would go this far. We gave you a job when no one else would. We trusted you with the family business. And this is how you repay us, by throwing a temper tantrum with the company ledgers. The gaslighting was masterful. They were actively rewriting reality in real time. They were taking a highly complex, meticulously executed money laundering syndicate that Richard and Jamal had run for years, and they were reducing it to the emotional outburst of a bitter, unstable spinster. They were setting the stage to convince the authorities, the media, and maybe even a jury that the missing millions were just the result of my supposed mental breakdown. I did not throw a temper tantrum. Mother, I said, my voice cutting through their manufactured hysteria like a blade. I did my job. I analyzed the numbers. I tracked the discrepancies. You authorized the transfers, Richard boomed, finally breaking his silence. He marched away from the fireplace, his face flushed with rage. He stopped right beside Jamal, projecting an overwhelming wall of masculine authority. Your digital signature is on every single fraudulent wire transfer that moved through the Cayman accounts this morning. Do you understand that Rachel, the feds have the digital logs? They have the time-stamped approvals. Your specific employee credentials were used to authorize the final movement of illicit funds just hours before the raid began. Richard pointed violently at the dossier resting on the glass table. The evidence is right there. It proves that you, the senior forensic auditor, deliberately bypassed our internal security protocols. You blinded the compliance software. You moved the money and you left your digital fingerprints all over the crime scene. I looked at the dossier, then at Jamal, who was watching me with a smug, satisfied expression. This was the scapegoat protocol. Jamal had engineered a digital framing so precise, so legally airtight, that any federal prosecutor would take one look at the logs and immediately indict me. They had used my system credentials to authorize their own theft, tying the noose perfectly around my neck while keeping their own hands completely clean. They fully expected me to break down crying. They expected me to fall to my knees, absolutely paralyzed by the overwhelming weight of the federal charges hanging over my head. They wanted me terrified, confused, and begging Jamal to save me from the prison sentence they had explicitly designed for me. Instead, I kept my hands casually tucked inside my coat pockets. I looked at my sister, whose chest was still heaving from her ridiculous self-centered outburst. I looked at my mother clutching her pearls in feigned devastation. I looked at my father radiating false righteousness. And finally, I locked eyes with Jamal. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. I just smiled a small, freezing smile that made the smug satisfaction instantly vanish from Jamal's face. If they wanted a war of evidence, they were about to get one. Jamal did not miss a beat. He smoothly ignored my challenge and leaned closer to the coffee table, flipping open the manila dossier with a practiced flick of his wrist. He was no longer just the arrogant brother-in-law. He had fully transitioned into his role as a high-powered corporate defense attorney, a man whose entire career was built on constructing impenetrable legal traps and burying his opponents under mountains of irrefutable paperwork. Let us examine the evidence. Rachel, Jamal said, his voice dropping into that chilling, persuasive cadence he used to dominate boardrooms and federal judges alike. This is the exact preliminary file that the Bureau has currently seized from the Vanguard mainframes. He slid a glossy printed page across the glass table. It was a dense spreadsheet completely covered in highlighted rows of transactional data and alphanumeric codes. I did not need to lean in closely to recognize the format. It was a raw server access log, the kind generated automatically whenever someone executed a high-level command within the Vanguard financial system. What you are looking at is a comprehensive network traffic report covering the last 48 hours, Jamal explained, tapping a manicured finger against a specific cluster of highlighted rows. These entries detail a massive coordinated transfer of corporate assets. We are talking about $32 million moved from our domestic holding accounts into an intricate web of offshore shell companies located in the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands. The transactions were broken down into dozens of smaller wires, meticulously designed to bypass our automated fraud detection algorithms. It was a sophisticated, brilliant piece of financial maneuvering. He paused, letting the silence hang heavily in the room. He wanted me to fully absorb the terrifying magnitude of the crime before he tightened the noose. The problem for you, Rachel, Jamal continued softly, is the digital authorization. He slid another document across the table. This one a detailed compliance sign-off sheet. Look right here. Look at the credentials used to manually override the security blocks. My eyes swept across the page and the cold dread in my stomach turned to pure freezing terror. Printed clearly at the bottom of the authorization log, stamped with a precise digital timestamp, was my unique employee identification number. My highly restricted encrypted access code. And beneath it my official digital signature as a senior forensic auditor. Jamal did not stop there. He pulled out a third document, laying it deliberately next to the others. This was not a financial ledger, it was a technical network report. These are the IP connection logs. Jamal stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. They show exactly where the login originated. The overriding commands were not executed from a workstation inside the Vanguard corporate headquarters. They were initiated remotely via the company's secure virtual private network, and the physical IP address traced directly back to your personal apartment in downtown Chicago. I stared at the pages, my breath catching in my throat. The trap was absolute perfection. They had not just stolen the money. They had built a meticulous, terrifyingly precise digital trail that led straight to my front door. They had used my stolen credentials to access the system, routed the connection through a spoofed IP address that perfectly matched my home network and stamped my official signature on the crime. "Do you understand this position you are in, Rachel?" Jamal asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "You are facing a multi-agency federal indictment. The Department of Justice is currently compiling charges for wire fraud, bank fraud, and violation of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act." He started pacing slowly behind the coffee table, a predator circling its trapped prey. "They have the financial logs proving the money moved. They have the access logs proving your credentials were used. And they have the IP tracking proving the crime was committed from your living room. It is a closed loop of evidence. A federal prosecutor will take one look at this file and conclude that you, the rogue auditor, used your extensive knowledge of the corporate systems to embezzle $32 million for your own personal gain." The sheer audacity of their plan was staggering. Richard and Catherine were perfectly content to sacrifice their own flesh and blood to protect their stolen empire. Vanessa was eagerly watching me burn, convinced this was some twisted form of justice for her wounded ego. And Jamal had orchestrated the entire frame-up, using his brilliant legal mind to ensure I had absolutely no way out. "When they arrest you," Rachel Jamal continued, stopping to look at me, "they are going to freeze all your assets. They are going to seize your bank accounts, your car, and that modest little apartment you are so incredibly proud of. You will have absolutely no resources to fight this. You will be assigned an overworked public defender who will spend exactly 15 minutes looking at this mountain of digital evidence before strongly advising you to accept a plea deal." Jamal leaned over the table, resting his hands flat against the glass, bringing his face closer to mine. "If you fight this in court, you will lose. The federal conviction rate for these types of financial crimes is over 95%. You will be standing in front of a federal judge completely alone, trying to explain how your computer magically hacked itself. The judge will not believe you. The jury will not believe you. You will be found guilty, and you will be sentenced to a minimum of 20 years in a federal penitentiary." The silence in the grand living room was deafening. My father, Richard, stood by the fireplace, radiating a terrifying, silent approval of Jamal's brutal assessment. My mother, Catherine, had stopped pretending to cry and was watching me with a cold, calculating stare. Vanessa looked absolutely thrilled, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips as she watched her husband systematically destroy my entire life. "You are 33 years old, Rachel," Jamal said, his voice softening into a sickeningly smooth, faux sympathetic tone. "A 20-year sentence means you will not see the outside of a prison cell until you are 53. Your career is over. Your reputation is completely destroyed. Your life as you know it is officially finished." He straightened his suit jacket, reclaiming his posture of absolute dominance. "The federal agents are probably securing warrants for your arrest right now. They will likely be at your apartment by this afternoon. You have a very narrow window of time, Rachel, and you only have one viable option left to survive this without spending the next 2 decades in federal lockup." Jamal reached into the manila dossier one last time. He pulled out a crisp, freshly printed legal document and placed it gently on the glass coffee table, right next to the fabricated evidence that condemned me. He set an expensive gold pen deliberately beside the paper. I stared at the document. It was not a piece of evidence. It was an elaborate, legally binding confession. It was the final nail in the coffin they had meticulously built for me, and they were handing me the hammer. I stared at the heavy gold pen resting against the crisp white paper. The silence in the grand living room was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of an antique grandfather clock standing in the hallway. Jamal smoothed the front of his tailored suit jacket and took a calculated step back, allowing me a clear, unobstructed view of the execution block he had meticulously prepared for me. That document is a lifeline. Rachel Jamal said, his voice dropping into a register of practiced artificial empathy that made my skin crawl. It is a fully drafted, legally binding confession. It states that you acted entirely alone. It outlines how you used your high-level system privileges to misappropriate corporate funds because you have been suffering from a prolonged, severe mental health crisis. It details a fabricated gambling addiction and profound psychological distress to explain exactly why the $32 million vanished from the company ledgers. I kept my eyes locked on the paper, feeling the sheer terrifying brilliance of his legal strategy. A mental health crisis. It was the perfect, inescapable narrative. Not only would it cleanly wrap up the federal investigation for Vanguard Logistics, but it would also completely destroy my credibility as a forensic auditor forever. If I ever tried to tell the truth in the future, if I ever tried to accuse Richard or Jamal of orchestrating the international wire fraud, the authorities would simply pull up this confession and write me off as a delusional, unstable woman making wild, paranoid accusations against her innocent family. If you fight us, you go to a federal penitentiary for 20 years. Jamal continued, stepping around the glass coffee table to stand shoulder to shoulder with my father. But if you sign that paper right now, my law firm will officially represent you. We have unparalleled relationships with the federal prosecutors in this district. We will submit this confession alongside a comprehensive psychological evaluation that I will personally ensure is handled by highly cooperative medical professionals. I will negotiate a plea deal for you. No jail time. You will get 5 years of federal probation and a lifetime ban from working in the financial sector. You lose your career, but you keep your freedom. He leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the back of the love seat where Vanessa was sitting. It is a remarkably generous offer, Rachel. You take the blame, the federal government gets their neatly packaged conviction, and the Vanguard executives remain completely untouched. Everyone wins. A lifetime ban. 5 years of federal probation. A permanent public record as an unstable, thieving corporate criminal. Jamal actually called it a win. I did not reach for the pen. I remained perfectly still, my hands resting deep inside the pockets of my wool coat, my face a mask of stone. Sensing my lack of immediate compliance, Catherine decided it was time to deploy the heavy artillery. My mother stood up from the silk sofa, the fabric rustling loudly in the quiet room. She walked toward me, the overwhelming scent of her expensive floral perfume hitting my senses like a physical wall. She reached out, attempting to place a comforting hand on my arm. I took a deliberate half-step backward, pulling myself safely out of her reach. Her face contorted with a rapid flash of genuine anger at my rejection, but she quickly masked it with an expression of profound, manufactured sorrow. Real tears welled in her eyes, spilling over her heavily mascaraed lashes and tracking down her perfectly powdered cheeks. "Rachel, please," Catherine begged, her voice trembling with flawless theatrical precision. "You have to do this for the family. You have to sign that paper." I looked down at the woman who had given birth to me, watching her weaponize the very concept of family simply to protect her stolen wealth. "We have sacrificed everything for you," Catherine cried, stepping closer aggressively, refusing to let me maintain my personal space. "We put a roof over your head. We paid for your college tuition when you had absolutely nothing. We supported you when you were struggling to find your way in the world. It is your turn to give back. It is your turn to take the hit to protect the people who raised you." The breathtaking audacity of her lies hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My mind instantly flashed back to my exhausting college years. I had worked grueling double shifts at a local diner, coming home at 2 in the morning, smelling of cheap grease and burnt coffee, just to afford my textbooks at a public state university. Richard and Catherine had explicitly refused to pay a single dime toward my education, claiming that investing in a degree for a mediocre daughter was a complete waste of capital. Meanwhile, they had gleefully written blank checks to fund Vanessa's luxurious Ivy League existence, paying for her European summer excursions and luxury campus apartments without batting an eye. They had never supported me. They had co-signed my apartment mortgage 5 years ago solely to maintain a legal grip on my finances, constantly holding it over my head to demand my unwavering obedience. And now Catherine was standing in a mansion paid for by international money laundering, demanding I sacrifice my entire life as payment for a debt I never even owed. Think about your sister, Catherine sobbed, gesturing wildly toward Vanessa, who immediately adopted a look of tragic vulnerability. Think about your niece and nephew. Do you really want those innocent children to grow up with their mother rotting in a federal prison? Do you want them to lose their beautiful home? Do you want them to grow up in terrifying poverty because you were too selfish to sign a simple piece of paper? Vanessa sniffled loudly from the love seat, dabbing her dry eyes with a silk tissue. I could never survive in a prison environment, Rachel. She whimpered, completely ignoring the fact that she was the one who had happily spent the stolen offshore money. My kids need me. You do not have a husband. You do not have children. You have absolutely nothing to lose. Please just sign the paper and save my family. You have nothing to lose. Those words echoed through the grand living room, hanging in the stagnant air with chilling clarity. In their eyes, my life was entirely expendable. Because I had dedicated my 30s to building a grueling, demanding career as an auditor, instead of marrying into a country club, my existence was completely devoid of value. My spotless reputation, my freedom, and my hard-earned independence meant absolutely nothing compared to Vanessa's imported luxury vehicles and Catherine's elevated social standing. They were asking me to willingly walk into a slaughterhouse, and they expected me to fall to my knees and thank them for the privilege. Richard took a heavy, intimidating step forward, towering over the glass table. The clock is ticking, Rachel. He barked, his voice vibrating with barely contained rage. The federal agents are tearing apart my company right now. You are going to pick up that pen, you are going to sign your name on that dotted line, and you are going to walk out of this house and turn yourself in to the authorities. You owe us your life, and today is the day you finally pay up. I looked at the four of them, the arrogant patriarch, the manipulative mother, the useless narcissistic sister, the ruthless calculating brother-in-law, a perfect syndicate of blinding greed and absolute delusion. I slowly pulled my hands out of my coat pockets. I looked down at the expensive gold pen resting next to the fraudulent confession. The trap was sprung, the walls were closing in, and they were utterly convinced they had already won. I reached forward, my arm extending across the expansive glass coffee table. My fingers closed around the cold, heavy metal of the gold pen. The moment the polished barrel lifted off the surface, the crushing tension in the grand living room evaporated entirely. It was as if a highly pressurized physical valve had been released, venting all the panic, dread, and manufactured hysteria out into the cold morning air. I held the pen, testing its weight in my grip. I could feel the eyes of my family tracking my every minuscule movement. Richard exhaled a loud, heavy breath, his broad shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch. The deep, violent shade of red that had flushed his face during his tyrant routine began to fade, quickly replaced by the familiar, sickeningly comfortable glow of absolute victory. He adjusted the cuffs of his cashmere sweater, his posture shifting from aggressive intimidation back to his default state of smug superiority. He had broken me. In his mind, the natural order of the universe had been flawlessly restored. The disobedient, disappointing middle child had finally folded under his supreme authority. He actually offered a small approving nod, a gesture of validation I had spent my entire childhood desperately chasing, but now found utterly repulsive. On the love seat, Vanessa underwent a miraculous, instantaneous recovery. The hysterical sobbing that had racked her body just moments ago stopped with the flick of an invisible switch. She did not even bother to wipe the remaining fake tears from her cheeks. Instead, she leaned back heavily against the silk cushions, crossing her legs again and letting out a long, dramatic sigh of relief. I watched her hand drop to her lap, her fingers instinctively reaching for her smartphone resting beside her. She was likely already composing a text message to her country club friends about how exhausting her morning had been. Her children, the ones she claimed were facing terrifying poverty, just seconds prior, had already vanished entirely from her mind. The crisis was averted, Her offshore money was safe, and her designated scapegoat had accepted the slaughter without a fight. Catherine clasped her hands together in front of her chest, offering a tight, patronizing smile that made my stomach churn with acid. She looked at me with an expression of magnanimous forgiveness, playing the benevolent matriarch who had successfully guided her troubled child back to the path of righteousness. "That is a good girl, Rachel," Catherine murmured, her voice dripping with artificial saccharine sweetness. "You are doing the right thing for everyone. When this is all over, we will make sure you are taken care of. We will send you to a nice, quiet medical facility where you can get the psychiatric help you so desperately need." Even Jamal allowed his relentless, predatory stare to soften. He stepped back from the coffee table, reaching up to casually adjust the perfect knot of his expensive silk tie. He gave a sharp, clinical nod, his mind visibly shifting gears from brutal psychological coercion to aggressive legal execution. "Excellent decision," Rachel Jamal said, his tone brisk and entirely professional. "Sign your full legal name and then date it at the bottom. I will have my senior paralegal file this with the federal prosecutor before the end of the hour. We will control the media narrative from the very first minute." I held the gold pen suspended just a millimeter above the crisp white paper. I stared at the dotted line, waiting for my signature. If the ink touched that page, my life as an independent, respected forensic auditor was over. My freedom would be traded for federal probation. My reputation would be permanently branded with the devastating stigma of a corporate criminal suffering from a severe psychological break. I let them bask in their triumph for a few more seconds. I let them savor the sweet, intoxicating taste of absolute control. For 33 years, this had been the exact dynamic of our twisted family structure. They demanded, they manipulated, and they expected total, unquestioning compliance. They believed I was inherently weak because I chose to live quietly in a modest apartment. They believed I was stupid because I refused to play their toxic, extravagant social games. They completely mistook my boundaries for vulnerability and my silence for submission. I slowly lifted my gaze from the fraudulent confession. My eyes bypassed Jamal, bypassed my arrogant father, and settled on the massive antique grandfather clock, standing in the arched hallway just beyond the living room doors. The heavy brass pendulum swung back and forth in a hypnotic, rhythmic arc, marking the passing seconds with a deep, echoing tick that cut through the silence of the room. The ornate black hands on the pristine white face were perfectly aligned. It was exactly 11:20 in the morning. The timing was flawless. I had stalled long enough. The elaborate legal trap they had so carefully laid out for me on this coffee table was now effectively useless, and the gears of a much larger, much more devastating machine were already in unstoppable motion. I lowered my hand. I did not drop the pen. I did not throw it across the room in a fit of dramatic anger. I moved with agonizing, deliberate slowness. I placed the heavy gold pen back down onto the glass coffee table, resting it exactly parallel to the typed confession. The soft, sharp click of the metal hitting the glass echoed like a gunshot in the suddenly quiet room. I straightened my spine, pulling my shoulders back until I was standing at my full height. I tucked my hands casually back into the deep pockets of my wool coat, planting my boots firmly into the expensive Persian rug. The temperature in the grand living room seemed to plummet by 10 degrees in a single second. The comfortable, smug relief that had just washed over my family instantly vanished, replaced by a sudden, jarring confusion. The air grew thick and heavy once more. I looked directly at Jamal, holding his sharp gaze without blinking, my expression completely blank, devoid of any fear, any sorrow, or any hesitation. "I am not signing this," I said. "What do you think would happen if I signed a confession for a crime I did not commit?" The silence in the room stretched until it felt like the walls were closing in. Jamal stared at me, his dark eyes narrowing as his brilliant, calculating brain struggled to process my blunt refusal. Richard, however, possessed no such restraint. His face darkened to a deep, dangerous purple, and he slammed both hands down onto the ornate marble mantelpiece. He took a heavy step toward me, closing the distance, trying to use his sheer physical size to intimidate me back into submission. He roared that I had no choice, that I was a foolish, ungrateful child who had no idea what kind of federal firestorm was currently consuming the corporate headquarters. He screamed that I was going to prison and he would personally make sure I got the maximum sentence if I continued to defy him. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply looked at my father with absolute chilling pity. "You really think you are a genius, Richard?" I said, my voice cutting through his screaming like a surgical scalpel. "You and Jamal sat in this mansion drinking expensive scotch and mapped out what you thought was an impenetrable digital frame job. You looked at my career, my spotless record, and my quiet life, and you saw nothing but a convenient patsy." I shifted my gaze back to Jamal. He had not moved, but the muscles in his jaw were clenched tight. He was a lawyer who dealt in airtight narratives, and he could sense my narrative shifting rapidly out of his control. I stepped closer to the glass coffee table, looking down at the scattered documents he had used to try and terrorize me just moments ago. "Let us look at your masterpiece, Jamal," I said, reaching down to pick up the glossy network traffic report he had been so proud to display. "You laid out the digital signature logs and the IP tracking data. You wanted to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was sitting in my living room in downtown Chicago, manually bypassing the compliance algorithms and funneling $32 million into your offshore accounts." I held the paper up, scanning the alphanumeric codes and highlighted rows with the practiced, rapid efficiency of a senior auditor. I had spent a decade breaking down ledgers infinitely more complex than this fabricated garbage. I tapped my index finger against a very specific column of data. "You spoofed my home IP address. It is a classic, relatively simple cyber maneuver. You mapped the digital address assigned to my personal wireless router, and you used a remote server to mimic it. To any federal agent doing a surface-level sweep, it looks exactly like the fraudulent wire transfers originated from my personal network." Jamal crossed his arms over his chest, trying to maintain his aura of untouchable superiority. "It does not just look like it, Rachel. The logs confirm it. The Department of Justice will trace the origin point directly to your apartment building. You can deny it all you want, but digital footprints do not lie." I smiled, a genuine, terrifying smile that caused the blood to visibly drain from Jamal's face. "You are absolutely right, Jamal. Digital footprints do not lie. But spoofing scripts run on automated timers, and automated timers cannot account for unpredictable human behavior." I tossed the network report back onto the glass table. It slid across the smooth surface, stopping inches from the fraudulent confession. "Look at the final authorization timestamp," I commanded, pointing sharply at the document. "Look at the exact minute the final transfer of $7 million was pushed through to the Cayman accounts. It says 8:15 this morning. According to this flawless federal evidence you manufactured, I was sitting at my kitchen island at 8:15 today, actively connected to the internet, routing stolen funds through the Vanguard servers." I took a deliberate step toward Jamal, forcing him to look me dead in the eye. "I did not log in today, Jamal. I did not open my laptop. I did not connect to the virtual private network. In fact, my apartment was completely devoid of an internet connection." Catherine gasped from the sofa, her hands flying to her mouth. Richard stopped his aggressive posturing, his heavy brow furrowing in deep confusion. Vanessa looked back and forth between her husband and me, completely lost. But Jamal understood exactly what I was saying. I could see the precise moment his brilliant legal mind processed the fatal, catastrophic flaw in his airtight frame job. His confident posture shattered. He uncrossed his arms and took a slow, unsteady step backward, his dark eyes wide with sudden, unadulterated panic. "My wireless router has been physically unplugged from the wall socket since 4 o'clock this morning," I stated, my voice echoing clearly through the grand living room. "It has had absolutely zero power flowing to it. It has emitted zero signal. It is physically, technically, and demonstrably impossible for an IP address to ping a corporate server from a router that has no electricity. When the federal agents pull the hardware logs from my internet service provider, they will not see a stable connection. They will see a total continuous blackout starting at 4 in the morning." I watched Jamal swallow hard, his throat bobbing nervously above his bespoke silk tie. If my router was completely dead at 8:15 Jamal, how exactly did I authorize that transfer? How did an offline apartment generate multi-million-dollar network traffic? The silence that descended upon the room this time was entirely different. It was not a weaponized silence meant to intimidate me. It was the suffocating, terrifying silence of criminals realizing the walls were rapidly closing in on them. They had built a perfect digital trap, but they had triggered it in an empty room. The spoofed IP address pinging the Vanguard servers, while my actual hardware was completely dead, was not just a mistake. It was undeniable, irrefutable proof of a coordinated digital framing. It proved that whoever moved the money was doing it remotely using my stolen credentials to cover their tracks. It proved the money laundering syndicate operated far above my pay grade and that I was an innocent victim being deliberately set up. Jamal opened his mouth to speak to offer some kind of slick legal rebuttal, but no words came out. The razor-sharp corporate defense attorney was completely paralyzed. His hands, usually so expressive and controlled, twitched nervously at his sides. He looked at the documents on the table as if they had suddenly caught fire. The fabricated evidence he had planned to hand to the federal prosecutors was now a massive, toxic liability. If he submitted those logs, he would be handing the Federal Bureau of Investigation the exact technical anomaly they needed to unravel the entire conspiracy. Jamal's facade cracked entirely, revealing the panicked, desperate criminal hiding beneath the expensive Italian suit. He realized in real time that he was no longer the apex predator in the room. He was trapped in the crosshairs and I held the weapon. The profound, terrified silence that gripped Jamal was suddenly shattered by a high-pitched, ear-piercing shriek. Vanessa, who had been watching her husband's confident posture dissolve into absolute panic, simply could not comprehend the technical reality of what had just happened. She did not understand IP spoofing. She did not understand router logs or digital blackouts. But she possessed the vicious, instinctual cunning of a lifelong manipulator, and she perfectly understood what losing looked like. She saw the impenetrable shield Jamal had built around her massive offshore bank accounts cracking right down the middle, and she completely lost her mind. She leapt up from the love seat with such sudden violent force that her knee knocked against the heavy glass coffee table, sending the fraudulent confession sliding toward the edge. Her perfectly curated persona of the unbothered wealthy socialite evaporated in a single second. Her face flushed an ugly, mottled crimson, the veins in her neck pulling tight as she closed the distance between us. "You have always been a difficult, ungrateful brat," Vanessa screamed, her voice echoing harshly off the vaulted ceilings and crystal chandeliers. "You ruin absolutely everything. We gave you a job. We gave you a life. And you sit there with your smug, miserable little face trying to drag my husband down just because you are a lonely, bitter spinster." Catherine took a frantic step forward, raising her hands in a futile attempt to calm her golden child. "Vanessa, sweetheart, please do not agitate yourself." Catherine pleaded, her own voice trembling with the realization that the entire situation was spiraling entirely out of control. Vanessa violently shoved our mother's hands away, her chest heaving under her cashmere loungewear. She pointed a manicured finger so close to my face I could feel the air moving against my cheek. "You have always been jealous of me, Rachel," she shrieked, saliva flying from her lips. "Since the day we were children. You could never stand the fact that I am beautiful, that I am married to a powerful man, that I actually deserve the life I have. You deliberately screwed up those audits. You intentionally brought the federal agents to our company just to destroy my inheritance out of pure psychotic spite." I stood perfectly still, letting her toxic, hysterical bile wash over me without flinching. For 33 years, this exact explosive tantrum had been Vanessa's ultimate weapon. Whenever she was challenged, whenever she faced a single ounce of accountability, she would scream and rage until our parents caved, immediately punishing me just to appease her. She expected me to shrink back. She expected me to lower my eyes and apologize just to stop the verbal assault. Instead, I took a deliberate, dominant step forward, forcing her to instinctively retreat a fraction of an inch. "Jealous of what, Vanessa?" I asked. my voice dropping into a register so cold and razor-sharp, it immediately commanded the entire room. Jealous of a life that is nothing but a purchased, fabricated illusion, I did not raise my voice to match hers. I used cold, devastating precision, wielding the truth like a surgical blade. Do you really want to talk about who deserves what they have? I continued, my gaze locking onto her panicked eyes. Let us talk about your prestigious Ivy League education. Let us talk about how you love to parade around the country club bragging about your brilliant academic pedigree. You and I both know you failed your entrance exams twice. You only got that acceptance letter because our father authorized a quiet $500,000 corporate donation to the university's alumni fund. He bought your admission outright because you were too academically lazy to earn it yourself. Vanessa gasped, her mouth opening and closing as she looked frantically toward Richard, silently begging him to shut me down. But Richard was entirely paralyzed by his own mounting legal terror. While you were spending your 20s taking European vacations on our father's dime and living in a luxury penthouse he rented for you, I was working graveyard shifts at a diner, I stated, stepping even closer, backing her up against the edge of the love seat. I came home at 3 in the morning smelling like stale grease and industrial bleach. I paid my own way through a state university. I passed my certification exams through pure grueling exhaustion, studying on freezing public buses while you were busy trying on wedding dresses. I earned my career with my own sweat and blood. You did not earn a single thing in your entire life. Shut up, Vanessa shrieked, clapping her hands over her ears like a petulant child. You are a liar. You are just a jealous, miserable liar. You hold a director title at Vanguard Logistics, I pressed on, stripping away the final layers of her fragile ego. You collect a massive executive salary, yet you do not even know how to open an Excel spreadsheet. Your entire position is a fraudulent tax write-off for this company. You are a phantom employee, Vanessa. A placeholder used to funnel illegal cash into your designer wardrobe and your offshore accounts. You have never worked a day in your life. You are a parasite feeding off a dying host. Tears of sheer, unadulterated rage streamed down Vanessa's face. She looked at Jamal, desperately expecting her ruthless corporate attorney husband to defend her honor, to silence me with threats of defamation. But Jamal was completely silent, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor, frantically trying to calculate his own survival in the face of my digital trap. He was abandoning her, and the realization hit Vanessa like a physical blow. Screaming at me does not change the digital forensics, I said, my voice eerily calm, ringing with absolute finality. The federal agents swarming the Vanguard corporate campus right now do not care about your country club status. They do not care about your temper tantrums. They do not care about how loudly you can scream at your younger sister. I paused, letting the devastating reality of her situation settle heavily over her shoulders. They care about wire fraud, Vanessa, I stated. They are going to look at the $3 million of stolen freight revenue that was quietly transferred into your personal accounts over the last 12 months. They are going to ask you to explain the precise mechanism of those offshore deposits. And when they put you in an interrogation room, without your father to buy your way out, and without Jamal to feed you the answers, you are going to break in exactly 5 minutes. Vanessa's knees finally buckled. The fight completely drained out of her, replaced by a sudden paralyzing terror. She collapsed back onto the silk cushions of the love seat, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps as she stared at me with wide, horrified eyes. She finally realized that the wealth and privilege that had protected her entire existence meant absolutely nothing against a federal indictment. The golden child was completely silenced. The toxic dynamic that had defined my entire life was permanently broken, crushed under the crushing weight of undeniable absolute logic. But as Vanessa surrendered to her panic, the true architect of the syndicate finally snapped. Richard stepped away from the marble fireplace, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. The patriarch of the family had lost his designated scapegoat, and his hubris was about to drag him straight into the fire. Richard did not rush to comfort his sobbing golden child. He did not even look at Vanessa as she sat hyperventilating on the silk cushions. His eyes were locked entirely on me, burning with a toxic, uncontrollable fury. The polished, aristocratic facade of the wealthy Lake Forest patriarch completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but the ruthless, predatory corporate tyrant who had spent his entire life crushing anyone who dared to stand in his way. He closed the distance between us in 3 long, aggressive strides. He stopped mere inches from my face, using his towering physical height to cast a dark shadow over me. I could smell the sharp metallic tang of expensive scotch on his breath and the underlying scent of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. "You think you are so incredibly clever, Rachel," Richard snarled, his voice vibrating with a dangerous guttural intensity. "You walk into my house, you insult my wife, you terrorize your sister, and you think you can just outsmart me with a technical glitch about a wireless router." I did not step back. I tilted my head up to meet his furious gaze, holding my ground. "It is not a glitch, Richard. It is a massive, gaping hole in your fabricated evidence. I do not care about the router," he roared, the sudden volume of his voice making the crystal prisms on the chandelier rattle above us. "I do not care about the IP addresses or the digital timestamps or whatever trivial technical details you think are going to save you. You are missing the entire point of your miserable existence." He pointed a heavy, commanding finger directly at my chest, striking my collarbone with a hard, aggressive jab. "I built Vanguard Logistics with my own 2 hands," Richard declared, his chest puffing out with blinding, absolute narcissism. "I took a failing regional trucking company and turned it into a global supply chain empire. Every ship, every warehouse, every single dollar that moves through those accounts belongs to me. I created the wealth that puts food on your table. I pay your salary. I own the building you work in. And make no mistake, Rachel, I own you." The absolute delusion in his eyes was staggering. He was standing in a room rapidly filling with the smoke of his burning empire, yet he still believed he was an untouchable god. He had completely detached from reality, consumed entirely by his own towering ego. "Do you really think you were hired because you were an exceptional auditor?" Richard laughed, a harsh barking sound, completely devoid of any humor. "You were hired because you are my daughter, and because you have always been desperate, lonely, and incredibly eager to please. Jamal and I needed a compliance officer with high-level access, someone who was too busy trying to earn a pat on the head to look closely at the offshore ledgers. You were not an employee, Rachel. You were a human shield I purchased the day I put you on the payroll." Hearing the absolute unfiltered truth spoken aloud did not hurt. It actually felt incredibly liberating. For my entire life they had gaslighted me, telling me my lack of connection with them was my own fault. But here was the undeniable reality screamed directly into my face. I was never a daughter. I was a designated casualty. "I used your credentials," Richard admitted, his voice dripping with intense, boastful pride. He was entirely incapable of keeping his mouth shut. His ego demanded that I acknowledge his supposed brilliance, completely unaware that he was loudly handing me a full verbal confession. It was incredibly easy. "You leave your security token in your desk drawer when you go to lunch. I had my personal security team clone your encrypted key fob 6 months ago. We logged your keystrokes, copied your digital signature, and mapped your daily routine." He stepped back, spreading his arms wide as if demanding applause for his criminal ingenuity. "While you were sitting in your cubicle meticulously checking domestic freight invoices, I was moving tens of millions of dollars right under your nose. I used your name to authorize the transfers to the Cayman accounts. I used your seal to blind the compliance software. I ran a multi-million-dollar shadow corporation using your identity, and you were completely oblivious. You are just a mid-level employee, Rachel. You do not dictate terms to the chief executive officer." I watched him with cold, calculating fascination. The man was a walking, talking federal indictment. He had just confessed to corporate espionage, identity theft, international money laundering, and wire fraud, all within the span of 2 minutes. His hubris was so massive, it completely blinded him to the extreme danger of his own words. "You are going to take the fall because I command it," Richard dictated, his face red and sweating from the exertion of his own rage. "I am your father, and you owe this family your absolute loyalty. I do not care if your router was unplugged. You are going to go back to your apartment right now. You are going to plug that machine into the wall log, into the server, and leave a digital footprint. Then you are going to sign Jamal's confession. He leaned down, bringing his face level with mine, his eyes burning with toxic, unwavering entitlement. You will walk into the federal prosecutor's office, and you will tell them you stole the money because you are sick in the head. You will take the plea deal. You will accept the probation. And if they decide to give you prison time instead, you will sit in a federal cell and keep your mouth shut to protect the family name. Do you understand me? You are nothing but an employee, and you will do exactly what I tell you to do. He had laid out his demands with absolute certainty, fully expecting me to cower, cry, and obey. He believed that his anger was a magic wand that could simply erase the gaping holes in their criminal conspiracy. He thought his booming voice could override federal evidence protocols. He was a tyrant who had lived his entire life surrounded by yes-men, completely unequipped to handle someone who was no longer afraid of him. I did not shout back. I did not match his aggressive energy. I simply let his heavy, tyrannical commands hang in the suffocating air of the living room, allowing the sheer weight of his staggering confession to settle perfectly into place. He had just handed me everything I needed, tying the final knot in his own execution. But before I could deliver the fatal blow, Catherine stepped out from the shadows of the silk sofa, her eyes gleaming with a vicious, unhinged desperation. Richard's screaming had not broken me, so my mother decided it was time to play her dirtiest card. Catherine reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a monogrammed silk handkerchief, and deliberately wiped away every single trace of her previously manufactured tears. The trembling, devastated matriarch vanished in the blink of an eye. Her posture stiffened, her chin lifted, and the soft, pleading sorrow in her eyes hardened into flat, reptilian cruelty. She walked around the glass coffee table, the sharp heels of her imported shoes clicking against the hardwood floor like the ticking of a metronome. She placed a hand on Richard's arm, silently commanding him to step back. He let out a heavy, furious breath, but complied, yielding the floor to his wife. "Richard is thinking entirely too much like a businessman," Catherine said, her voice completely devoid of the hysterical panic she had displayed just moments ago. It was smooth, coated in ice, and dripping with aristocratic venom, and Jamal is thinking entirely too much like a defense attorney. They are trying to bully you with logic and federal statutes. But I know you, Rachel. I know exactly how stubborn you are. So I am going to explain exactly how this is actually going to play out. She closed the distance between us, stopping just outside my personal space. The cloying scent of her expensive floral perfume was nauseating. "You are not going to a federal penitentiary," Catherine stated, a vicious, chilling smile touching the corners of her mouth. "Prison is for competent adults who commit rational, calculated crimes." That is not the narrative we are going to give the media, and it is certainly not the narrative we are going to hand to the federal prosecutors. I maintained my steady gaze, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction, but my mind was racing to anticipate her angle. "We are going to tell the absolute tragic truth about our deeply disturbed middle daughter." Catherine continued, her voice dropping into a theatrical whisper of mock sorrow. "We are going to explain how your intense isolation in that dreary little apartment finally took its toll. We are going to testify under oath and through heartbreaking tears about your severe, prolonged psychological decline. We will tell the judge about your terrifying paranoid delusions, your obsessive-compulsive fixation on the Vanguard corporate ledgers, and your deep-seated schizophrenic jealousy toward your older sister." The sheer, breathtaking depravity of her words hung in the air. Vanessa leaned forward on the love seat, her eyes widening with a sick, fascinated gleam as she realized exactly what our mother was orchestrating. Even Jamal straightened his posture, his sharp legal mind instantly recognizing the devastating effectiveness of Catherine's strategy. An insanity defense. If the architect of the multi-million-dollar fraud was deemed legally and medically incompetent, any accusations I made against Richard or Jamal would be instantly dismissed as the wild, paranoid ravings of a lunatic. "You cannot just invent a medical history," I said, keeping my tone perfectly flat. "Federal investigators verify everything. They will subpoena my medical records. They will see I have never had a single psychological evaluation in my life. Catherine let out a short, elegant laugh that chilled me to the bone. Oh, Rachel, you are so terribly naive about how the world actually works for people with our level of influence. Do you know Dr. Montgomery? The chief of psychiatry at the premier private medical facility in the state. He is a very close, very personal friend of our family. In fact, your father quietly forgave a massive, highly embarrassing private loan for him just last year. She tilted her head, her eyes locking onto mine with absolute murderous intent. Dr. Montgomery will be more than happy to retroactively create a highly detailed, comprehensive medical file documenting your secret decade-long battle with severe psychotic delusions. He will personally testify that you have been off your medication for months and that orchestrating this massive financial disaster was simply the tragic climax of a severe psychological break. The blood in my veins ran entirely cold. She was not just threatening my career or my freedom. She was threatening to systematically erase my entire reality. She was leveraging her country club connections and her husband's dirty money to medically gaslight me on a federal scale. You will not go to a minimum security prison camp, Catherine whispered, leaning in so close I could feel the heat of her breath. You will be remanded to a locked high-security psychiatric ward, and because you will be deemed legally incompetent, I will personally petition the court for a full permanent medical conservatorship. I am your mother. The judge will grant it without hesitation. The absolute darkness of the woman standing in front of me was staggering. The woman who had given birth to me was actively planning to strip away my basic human rights. She was looking me dead in the eye and promising to lock me inside an asylum, pump my veins full of heavy antipsychotic medication, and silence me forever. All to protect her Persian rugs, her charity galas, and her stolen offshore bank accounts. I will control your finances. Catherine listed her smile widening into something truly monstrous. I will control your medical decisions. I will control whether or not you are ever allowed to have visitors. You will spend the rest of your natural life heavily sedated in a white room, and every single person in the world will look at us with profound sympathy for having to endure the tragedy of such a broken, crazy daughter. Jamal nodded slowly in the background, the panic completely gone from his face. It is a bulletproof strategy, Rachel. Jamal added, his voice returning to its smug, arrogant baseline. The federal prosecutor gets to close the Vanguard case without a messy public trial. The company's stock rebounds because the fraud is pinned on a single mentally ill employee. And your wild accusations against the executive board are completely buried under a mountain of authenticated psychiatric diagnoses. Sign the confession, now take the 5 years of probation, and we can avoid the medical route entirely. The choice is yours. They looked at me, a unified front of absolute terrifying cruelty. They had played their darkest, dirtiest card, fully expecting my knees to buckle. They expected me to beg for the prison plea deal just to escape the horrifying threat of a permanent medical conservatorship. I looked at my mother. I looked at the woman who was perfectly willing to cannibalize her own child's sanity to save her luxury lifestyle. The profound betrayal did not break me. It did not make me cry. It transcended anger, pushing me into a realm of pure crystalline clarity. The last remaining microscopic shred of familial loyalty I held in my heart evaporated, leaving behind nothing but absolute diamond. I am not going to a psychiatric ward. Mother, I said, my voice echoing with a terrifying, absolute calm that made her vicious smile falter. And I am not going to federal prison. Because while you and Richard were busy figuring out how to buy off a corrupt psychiatrist, you completely failed to secure your actual digital perimeter. You failed to realize exactly who you were inviting into your network. The vicious, triumphant smile on Catherine's face froze, then slowly fractured into a look of profound, deeply unsettled confusion. She glanced nervously at Richard, but the towering patriarch of the family was equally paralyzed. For the first time since I walked into the grand living room, the absolute certainty of their criminal syndicate began to crack. They had planned for my tears. They had prepared for my panicked submission. They had even anticipated a futile legal argument. But they had completely failed to anticipate that I had been actively hunting them for over a year. Jamal stepped forward, his dark eyes narrowing into two sharp, calculating slits. He dropped his hands to his sides, his aggressive legal posture shifting into something much more defensive. "What network are you talking about?" Jamal demanded, his smooth baritone voice tightening with the very first edge of genuine anxiety. "We control the entire Vanguard infrastructure. Our internal security teams monitor every single byte of data that moves through the corporate servers. No one was invited into the network without my explicit authorization." I looked at the brilliant, arrogant corporate defense attorney and let out a short, cold laugh. "Let us talk about the guy who lives down the hall from my apartment," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Let us talk about my quiet, unassuming neighbor David." Jamal frowned, completely failing to understand the relevance. He exchanged a quick, irritated glance with Richard. "David is a mid-level cybersecurity contractor," Jamal stated dismissively. "I personally vetted his firm before Vanguard hired him to run routine server maintenance. He is a nobody. He sits in a cubicle and runs automated firewall patches." "He is exactly what you think he is, Jamal," I corrected smoothly. "Because that is the precise corporate profile we meticulously engineered for him 14 months ago. You hired David as a mid-level contractor for Vanguard Logistics, but I hired David first." The color began to drain rapidly from Jamal's face. The razor-sharp gears in his head were spinning furiously, trying to calculate the exact scope of his exposure. 14 months ago, I noticed the first anomalies in the third-quarter freight ledgers. I explained, walking slowly around the glass coffee table, commanding the physical space they had previously used to trap me. I saw the ghost shipments. I saw the massive capital expenditures bleeding out to phantom vendors in the Cayman Islands. But I also knew that Richard controlled the internal IT department. If I raised a red flag, if I initiated an official internal audit, my father would simply wipe the servers and fire me before the ink on my report was even dry. I stopped in front of Richard, staring directly into his horrified eyes. I needed someone on the inside who had high-level administrative access but was completely invisible to your executive board. I needed a ghost. So I found David. He is not a routine maintenance tech. He is an elite independent cybersecurity contractor who specializes in aggressive corporate espionage and forensic digital recovery. Catherine let out a sharp, trembling breath, her hands fluttering nervously up to her pearl necklace. Vanessa remained completely silent on the love seat, her eyes darting frantically around the room, desperately waiting for her husband to fix the situation. "You cannot bypass my spoofing protocols," Jamal argued, though his voice was completely stripped of its previous commanding authority. His breathing had become shallow and fast. "I built a proprietary tunneling script. Even an elite contractor cannot simply hack through an encrypted, decentralized proxy chain without triggering the corporate alarms. If David tried to monitor the server traffic, my software would have immediately flagged his intrusion." "He did not need to monitor the server traffic, Jamal," I replied, shaking my head with mocking pity. "He did not touch your precious encrypted proxy chains. We knew you would build an impenetrable digital wall around the offshore accounts. We knew you would manipulate the IP logs to frame me. You are a brilliant defense attorney, and you think entirely in terms of network security and software firewalls." I took a step closer to Jamal, lowering my voice into a cold, devastating whisper. "So David completely ignored your software. He went straight for the hardware." Jamal physically recoiled as if I had struck him. His dark eyes widened in absolute blinding terror. "David did not hack Vanguard Logistics," I stated, delivering the killing blow with surgical precision. "He hacked the unsecured personal wireless network right here at this multi-million-dollar Lake Forest estate. 6 months ago, while you and Richard were hosting your lavish summer charity gala on the back lawn, David was sitting in a catering van in your driveway. He gained direct access to Richard's personal MacBook Pro. He installed a deep-root keystroke logger directly onto the motherboard." Richard let out a strangled, suffocating gasp, his hands flying out to grip the marble mantelpiece to keep himself from collapsing to the floor. The patriarch of the family, the untouchable god of the supply chain empire, finally realized he had personally handed me the weapon of his own destruction. For the last 6 months, I continued, my voice ringing with total unyielding authority. "Every single time Richard opened his personal laptop to manage your illegal syndicate, David captured the raw data. We do not just have your offshore account numbers. We have the master administrative passwords. We have the encrypted chat backups where you and Jamal explicitly discussed how to clone my security token. We have thousands of hours of high-definition screen recordings showing Richard's own hands typing the exact commands used to authorize the fraudulent wire transfers. The room was spinning into absolute chaos, but nobody dared to make a sound. They were completely paralyzed, crushed under the staggering, monumental weight of their own arrogance. That is why David lives down the hall from me, I explained, looking at my mother's terrified, pale face. We could not risk transferring the stolen data across an active internet connection where Jamal might intercept it. We needed an air-gapped transfer system, so David moved into my building. Every Friday evening for 14 months, he simply walked down the hallway, knocked on my door, and handed me a physical encrypted hard drive containing the undeniable proof of your massive federal crimes. I turned my attention back to Catherine. My mother was shaking violently, her threat of a fabricated psychological evaluation completely vaporized by the sheer magnitude of the physical evidence I possessed. "You cannot put me in a psychiatric ward, Mother," I said, stripping away her vicious blackmail with brutal efficiency. "You cannot bribe Dr. Montgomery to forge medical records declaring me insane." Because a woman suffering from a severe psychological break does not quietly orchestrate a 14-month highly sophisticated corporate espionage operation against her own family. A delusional spinster does not meticulously gather airtight physical evidence of international money laundering. I looked at the four of them, my family completely stripped of their wealth, their power, and their toxic manipulation. They were exposed, raw, and absolutely terrified. And the best part, I added, feeling a profound, intoxicating wave of pure freedom wash over me, is that David knocked on my door at exactly 4 o'clock this morning. He handed me the final hard drive, the one containing the screen recordings of Richard authorizing the $32 million transfer last night. Jamal slowly brought a shaking hand up to cover his mouth. He realized with absolute horrifying certainty that his brilliant legal career was effectively dead. He had spent months constructing the perfect digital frame job, completely unaware that I had been standing right behind him the entire time, holding a high-definition camera. Jamal lowered his shaking hand from his mouth, his dark eyes wide and unfocused. The immaculate, untouchable corporate defense attorney was entirely gone. In his place stood a terrified, cornered animal rapidly suffocating under the crushing weight of a multi-agency federal indictment. The tailored Italian suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for him as his posture completely collapsed. He began to pace. He walked the length of the Persian rug, his expensive leather shoes dragging slightly, running his hands frantically over his closely cropped hair. A visible sheen of cold sweat broke out across his forehead, catching the light from the crystal chandelier above. He was mumbling to himself at first, a rapid, disjointed stream of legal statutes and sentencing guidelines. Wire fraud, identity theft, corporate espionage, conspiracy to commit federal bank fraud, obstruction of justice, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. He was verbally calculating the exact number of decades he was about to spend locked inside a maximum security federal penitentiary. He knew the Department of Justice did not offer plea deals to the legal architects of massive criminal syndicates. They made brutal, highly public examples out of them. They would strip him of his law license, seize every asset he had ever accumulated, freeze his bank accounts, and bury him under an avalanche of undeniable digital evidence. Jamal suddenly stopped pacing and whirled around to face Richard. The deference and respect he usually reserved for his powerful, wealthy father-in-law vanished, replaced by a vicious, cornered desperation. "You arrogant, careless fool!" Jamal spat, his voice cracking with sheer panic as he pointed an accusing finger directly at Richard's chest. "You compromised the physical perimeter. I built you a bulletproof digital fortress. I gave you encrypted routing protocols, spoofed IP addresses, and completely untraceable offshore shell companies. And you let a cybersecurity contractor sit in a catering van in your own driveway and hack your personal motherboard during a charity gala." Richard, still gripping the marble mantelpiece with white knuckles, turned a deep, furious shade of crimson. "Do not speak to me like that in my own house, Jamal. I am the chief executive officer of this company. I am the one who gave you everything you have. You are a walking federal conviction, Jamal shouted, completely abandoning any remaining pretense of family loyalty. You are toxic waste, Richard. They have screen recordings of your actual hands executing the fraudulent transfers. They have the deep-root keystroke logs. There is absolutely no legal defense for a physical hardware breach of that magnitude. You handed them the entire operation on a silver platter because you were too cheap to hire competent physical security for your own estate. I am not going down for your staggering, breathtaking incompetence. Vanessa sobbed loudly from the love seat, reaching out a trembling hand toward her husband. Jamal, please stop yelling. We are a family. We can fix this. You just need to talk to the lawyers. Jamal did not even look at his wife. He swatted her hand away with a dismissive, aggressive gesture, his raw survival instincts completely overriding his marriage vows. There is no fixing a direct hardware capture, Vanessa. The federal agents have already breached the Vanguard servers. Once they cross-reference their internal corporate data with the physical logs on Rachel's hard drive, the entire legal shield is instantly obliterated. Our narrative is dead. We are completely out of time. Jamal turned back to me. His breathing was rapid and shallow, but I could see the desperate calculating gears shifting in his dark eyes. He was a man who negotiated with ruthless federal prosecutors and aggressive billionaires for a living. He understood that when all the brilliant legal arguments completely failed, the only remaining currency in the world was raw, unadulterated cash. He closed the distance between us, stopping just a few feet away. He dropped his voice, attempting to project a calm, transactional authority that his sweating face and violently shaking hands completely betrayed. "Listen to me very carefully," Rachel Jamal said, speaking rapidly, the words tumbling over each other. "You are angry. You are deeply hurt. I completely understand that. Richard and Catherine have treated you appallingly your entire life, and they deserve absolutely everything that is coming to them. I will personally testify against Richard if the Bureau offers me immunity. I will hand them the remaining offshore ledgers. But you and I are both intelligent, pragmatic professionals. We do not need to destroy each other today." I kept my expression perfectly blank, letting him dig his own grave. I watched him mentally throw his wife and his father-in-law to the federal wolves without a single second of hesitation. "You have the hard drive," Jamal continued, his eyes darting frantically toward the grandfather clock in the arched hallway. The ornate black hands showed 11:35. "We have an incredibly narrow window before this situation becomes permanently unfixable. If you hand that hard drive over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, you get the satisfaction of revenge. But revenge does not pay your mortgage, Rachel. Revenge does not fund your retirement account. It just leaves you tied up in exhausting grand jury hearings and federal depositions for the next 5 years of your life." He stepped 1 inch closer, lowering his voice into a desperate, pleading whisper. "I have a private, fully secured account with a Swiss financial institution that is completely disconnected from the Vanguard corporate network. It operates strictly outside of United States jurisdiction. No federal subpoenas can touch it. The authorities do not know it exists. It contains $5 million in clean, untraceable capital. I can initiate a direct, irrevocable wire transfer to any offshore account you designate right this very second. The money will clear and be completely accessible to you by 11:45. $5 million, Rachel. Tax-free, untraceable, yours to keep forever, to keep." Catherine gasped loudly, her hands flying to her face in utter shock as she watched her son-in-law attempt to buy his way out of the sinking ship, using hidden funds he had clearly kept secret from the rest of the family. Richard looked like he was about to suffer a massive coronary event, his chest heaving with furious, impotent rage at the ultimate betrayal. "All you have to do," Jamal pleaded, his dark eyes wide with frantic begging. "Desperation is hand me David's hard drive. Or smash it. Throw it in the fireplace. Drop it in the lake out back. Just destroy the physical evidence of Richard's keystrokes. You can walk out of this mansion right now a multi-millionaire, and you will never have to speak to any of these toxic, miserable people ever again. $5 million, Rachel. I will initiate the transfer on my phone right now. Just give me the drive." I looked at the brilliant corporate lawyer. I watched the heavy sweat dripping down his temples and the uncontrollable tremor in his hands. He was offering me a massive fortune, fully believing that every single person on earth had a price. He thought my silence could be purchased, just like he had purchased his own morality years ago. He was offering me an escape hatch, completely unaware that I had already bolted all the doors from the outside. The heavy silence that followed Jamal's desperate $5 million bribe was broken by a sudden, jagged sob from the love seat. Vanessa, the pristine golden child who had spent her entire 36 years gliding through life on a carpet of stolen money, finally shattered completely. The reality of Jamal throwing her father to the federal wolves, combined with the terrifying prospect of losing her wealth and freedom, broke whatever fragile mental dam was holding her together. She slid off the silk cushions and collapsed onto the Persian rug. Her knees hit the floor with a heavy, ungraceful thud. She crawled forward across the intricate woven patterns, grabbing the hem of my wool coat with trembling, desperate hands. "Rachel, please." Vanessa wept. These were not the calculated theatrical tears she had weaponized just a half-hour ago. Her face was blotchy, her breath coming in ragged, ugly, heaving gasps. "Please, just take the money. Take the $5 million. You can move anywhere you want. You can start your own firm. Just give him the drive. I cannot go to prison. I have children. I will never ask you for anything ever again. I will disappear. Just take his deal and let us go." I looked down at my older sister. The woman who had mercilessly bullied me, mocked my career, and eagerly watched as her husband tried to frame me for a 20-year felony, was now groveling at my boots like a beaten animal. Beside her, Jamal stood entirely frozen, his hand still hovering near his jacket pocket where his phone rested, waiting for my authorization to initiate the offshore wire transfer. Across the room, Catherine and Richard watched this pathetic display in a state of catatonic shock. Their perfect, curated family was cannibalizing itself right in front of their eyes. $5 million. For a fraction of a second, I let the number hang in the air. To a mid-level forensic auditor, that amount of money represented a lifetime of absolute financial security. It meant early retirement, a house on the coast, a life completely insulated from the corporate grind. Jamal knew this. He had calculated my salary, my mortgage, and my student loan debt, and he had offered a figure he believed was mathematically impossible for me to refuse. But Jamal made the fatal error of assuming that my moral compass operated on the same corrupt transactional ledger as his own. He thought I wanted to be rich. He failed to understand that I wanted to be clean. I felt no triumph in seeing Vanessa on her knees. I felt no temptation at the thought of Jamal's hidden millions. I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, chilling disgust that settled deep into the marrow of my bones. I reached down, grasped Vanessa by her trembling wrists, and physically pried her hands off my coat. I stepped back, severing the physical contact, treating her like something toxic that I refused to let contaminate me any longer. "You want to buy my silence for $5 million, Jamal?" I asked, my voice cutting through Vanessa's pathetic sobbing. I turned my attention back to the corporate defense attorney. "You think you can just wire transfer your way out of a deep-root hardware capture? You think I am going to accept hush money from a secret Swiss account that you hid from your own father-in-law?" I looked at Richard, who was staring at Jamal with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "Do you see him now, Richard?" I asked, driving the wedge between them even deeper. "Do you see the brilliant legal mind you brought into this house to protect your empire? The second the federal heat turned on, he abandoned you. He abandoned his wife. He offered to sell out the entire Vanguard executive board just to save his own skin, using the very capital he skimmed off the top of your illegal operation. He is a coward, and you were a fool to trust him." I did not wait for Richard to respond. I swept my gaze across the grand living room, looking at each of them, dissecting their entire existence with cold, undeniable precision. "For 33 years, I have listened to you dictate my worth." I stated, my voice ringing with absolute, unwavering authority. "You told me I was a failure because I did not want to participate in your shallow, materialistic country club lifestyle. You called me stupid. You called me ungrateful. You spent decades attempting to break my spirit so you could keep me isolated and compliant. You co-signed a lease just to hold it over my head. You fed me scraps of affection and expected me to act like I was starving for your approval. I pointed a finger at Catherine, who flinched as if she had been struck. You are not a mother. A mother does not threaten to forge psychiatric records to lock her own child inside an asylum. You do not love me, Catherine. You only love the control you exerted over me. You are a social parasite who used my existence to play the tragic martyr for your wealthy friends, spinning elaborate tales of my supposed incompetence just to garner their sympathy and elevate your own status. You wear your pearls and you host your charity galas, but beneath the designer dresses, you are completely morally bankrupt. I turned to Richard, who was leaning heavily against the mantel, his chest heaving with defeated rage. You are not a patriarch. A patriarch protects his family. You are a deeply narcissistic thief who stole from a multi-billion-dollar corporation and tried to use his daughter as a human shield because you were too arrogant to believe you could ever be caught. I looked down at Vanessa, who was still kneeling on the rug, weeping into her hands. And you are not a sister. You are an empty, hollow shell of a person who has never achieved a single independent milestone in her entire life. You are a grown woman who still demands a weekly allowance from her father. You happily spent stolen money on luxury cars and designer vacations, and you happily watched them try to frame me because your fragile ego simply could not tolerate the idea of me surviving outside your shadow. You begged me just now, not because you love me, but because you are terrified of losing your personal chef and your country club membership. I took a deep, cleansing breath of the stale, heavily perfumed air inside the mansion. The suffocating weight of my childhood, the endless anxiety of trying to please them, the desperate yearning for a familial love that never actually existed within these walls, it all completely vanished. I was entirely free. I am not taking your blood money, Jamal, I said, delivering the final crushing verdict. I am not destroying the hard drive. I am not accepting your apologies, and I am not offering any forgiveness. Because forgiveness requires genuine remorse, and the only thing any of you are sorry for is getting caught. I looked at the four of them one last time, cementing their horrified, ruined faces into my memory. You aren't my family. I declared, my words echoing with chilling absolute finality. You're just a syndicate of thieves, and I don't negotiate with criminals. Jamal stared at me, his chest heaving under his tailored suit. His legal mind was desperately trying to find a single microscopic crack in the concrete wall I had just dropped on top of him. He shook his head, a gesture of frantic denial. You cannot trace the Cayman accounts. Jamal choked out his voice, a ragged, desperate whisper. I buried those holding companies behind 3 layers of nominee directors and strict bank secrecy laws. You cannot pierce the corporate veil from a cubicle. The offshore structure is legally impenetrable. I looked at the sweating, terrified lawyer and felt a deep, profoundly satisfying wave of vindication. You think exactly like a lawyer, Jamal, I said, keeping my tone analytical and razor-sharp. You build intricate legal mazes. You construct walls out of shell companies' bearer shares and international jurisdiction loopholes. You genuinely believed that if the names on the incorporation documents were hidden, the money was invisible. But I am not a lawyer. I am a forensic auditor. I do not read contracts. I read the physics of money, and money is kinetic. It always leaves a wake. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the glass coffee table commanding the center of the room. Richard and Catherine remained entirely motionless, trapped by the terrifying realization that the daughter they had treated like a fool was currently dissecting their entire empire. It started 14 months ago with the international freight ledgers, I explained, looking directly at my father. You were signing off on massively inflated vendor invoices for global freight forwarding. You claimed Vanguard Logistics was paying premium expedited rates for shipping containers out of our terminals in Singapore. You pushed millions of dollars into a vendor account for a company called Zenith Maritime. On paper signed by the chief executive officer, it looked like a perfectly standard, albeit expensive operational cost. Richard swallowed hard, the color continuing to drain from his face as I casually named the phantom vendor he had used to steal his own company's cash. But you forgot that logistics is a physical science. I continued, my voice echoing with cold, undeniable logic. You cannot fake the physical movement of thousands of tons of steel. I pulled the bill of lading numbers from your approved Zenith Maritime invoices, and I cross-referenced them with the public international maritime databases. The massive cargo ships you supposedly chartered for those premium expedited runs across the Pacific Ocean were not at sea. According to the international port registries, those specific ships were sitting in dry dock in the Philippines, undergoing routine hull maintenance. You were authorizing payouts of $3 million a month to move phantom shipping containers on boats that could not even float. Richard physically staggered back against the marble fireplace, his mouth falling open in sheer disbelief. The brilliant titan of industry, the man who constantly mocked my career, had been caught because he did not understand the basic operational physics of his own supply chain. He had been so entirely consumed by his own greed and arrogance that he left massive, glaring operational breadcrumbs trailing right behind him. Once I found the phantom ships, finding the money was incredibly simple, I said, turning my attention back to Jamal. The payments to Zenith Maritime were routed through a correspondent bank in New York and then immediately wired to a holding company in Grand Cayman. You created 3 separate layers of limited liability companies to wash the funds: Pinnacle Holdings, Obsidian Logistics, and Zenith Maritime. Legally, it was a masterpiece of obfuscation. You used nominee directors to completely shield your identities from the federal regulators. Jamal gripped the edge of the sofa, his knuckles turning white as he braced himself for the killing blow. But financially, Jamal, your setup was an absolute disaster, I stated, stripping away the last remaining shreds of his professional pride. You routed all 3 shell companies through the exact same registered financial agent, a boutique, highly secretive law firm located in Georgetown. You thought using a high-end Caribbean firm made you untouchable. But you made a fatal, staggering rookie mistake. You used that exact same registered agent in the Cayman Islands to establish the domestic holding trust that officially owns this multi-million-dollar Lake Forest estate. Catherine let out a sharp, choked gasp, realizing that her pristine, luxurious mansion was now directly, irrefutably tied to the money laundering syndicate. I did not have to pierce your corporate veil, Jamal, I explained, watching the absolute horror wash over his face. You tied the offshore theft directly to your own front door. But the absolute best part, the piece of evidence that truly proves how blindingly arrogant you are, was the digital metadata. Jamal's eyes widened to the size of saucers. The word metadata hit him like a physical punch to the gut. You generated the fake Zenith Maritime vendor invoices yourself, I said, leaning slightly forward to deliver the final technical strike. You saved them as PDF files, and you uploaded them to the Vanguard accounting portal for Richard to approve. You were so incredibly confident in your Caribbean legal shielding that you completely forgot to scrub the digital properties of the files you created. The author tag buried deep in the code of those fraudulent invoices did not trace back to a shipping manager in Southeast Asia. It traced back to the registered software license belonging to your own corporate defense firm. You generated the fake invoices from your own office desktop. Jamal covered his face with his hands, letting out a low, agonizing groan of pure defeat. The slick, untouchable lawyer had left his own digital fingerprints all over the crime scene simply because he was too arrogant to check the file properties. I did not even need David to hack your father-in-law's motherboard to know exactly what you were doing, I declared, my voice ringing with total, sweeping victory. I had the entire financial map drawn out, verified, and cross-referenced 6 months ago. I knew every routing number. I knew every fake vendor. I knew the exact flow of every single stolen dollar. David's hardware capture merely provided the definitive proof of who was pressing the buttons. You did not just leave a paper trail. You left a multi-lane highway paved with your own staggering incompetence. I looked at the broken syndicate of thieves standing in the grand living room. They were completely silent, utterly decimated by the sheer scale of their own failure. You hired me because you thought I was a desperate, obedient little girl who would blindly stamp your compliance reports just to earn a pat on the head, I said, offering them a cold, merciless smile. You mocked my quiet life. You told everyone I was a disappointment. But my quiet life meant I had the uninterrupted time, the forensic training, and the absolute razor-sharp focus required to tear your entire criminal enterprise down to the studs. You thought you were playing chess with a child. You did not realize I had already flipped the entire board. The ornate black hands of the antique grandfather clock out in the grand hallway shifted with a heavy, echoing mechanical thud. It was exactly 11:55 in the morning, 5 minutes until noon. The crushing weight of my verbal dismantling hung heavily in the room, suffocating the last remaining breaths of their arrogant defiance. Jamal was completely broken, staring blankly at the intricate patterns of the Persian rug, as if trying to calculate exactly how many years he would spend behind bars. Vanessa was curled tightly on the love seat, rendered entirely mute by the sheer, incomprehensible scale of the disaster. Catherine looked physically ill, her perfectly manicured hands trembling violently where they rested against the fabric of her silk dress. But Richard was not broken. A man who has spent his entire adult life acting as an untouchable corporate tyrant does not simply surrender when outsmarted. When his intellect and his expensive legal shields failed him, his primal violent instincts immediately took over. A dark, terrifying shift washed over my father's face. The shock and humiliation mutated instantly into pure, unadulterated physical rage. He let out a feral, aggressive snarl and pushed himself violently away from the marble mantel. With heavy, stomping strides, he crossed the grand living room and positioned his massive frame directly in front of the arched double doors. He planted his feet wide, crossing his thick arms over his chest, effectively barricading the only exit out of the room. "You are not walking out of this house!" Richard bellowed, his voice dropping into a dangerous, gravelly threat that vibrated through the floorboards. "I do not care what digital evidence you think you have. I do not care about your little cybersecurity neighbor or your offshore banking analysis. You are my daughter, and you will not leave this room until you fix what you have broken." He took a menacing step forward, his fists clenching so tightly his knuckles turned white. "I will physically lock you in the basement if I have to, Rachel. I will take your phone, I will strip you of your credentials, and I will keep you trapped here until Jamal figures out a legal strategy to bury this entire mess. You are not going to destroy my company and just casually walk out the front door." In the past, the sheer physical threat of my father's towering rage would have completely paralyzed me. I would have backed away, my heart pounding with instinctual, ingrained childhood fear, desperate to appease him before his anger escalated into actual violence. But I did not step back. I did not raise my hands in defense. I did not even break eye contact. Instead, I slowly turned away from him. I walked directly over to the lone, heavy leather armchair that Jamal had aggressively ordered me to sit in just an hour ago. Back then, it was meant to be an interrogation seat, a place of psychological submission. Now I claimed it as a throne of absolute authority. I sat down slowly, leaning my back against the tufted leather. I crossed one leg over the other, resting my hands casually on the armrests, and looked at my father with an expression of profound, unbothered boredom. "Are you seriously threatening to hold a senior forensic auditor hostage in your suburban mansion, Richard?" I asked, my voice laced with heavy mocking disbelief. "Do you genuinely believe that physically trapping me in this room is going to magically reverse a massive federal raid? The government is currently seizing your servers, and your grand strategic response is to block a wooden door with your body. You are not thinking like a chief executive officer anymore. You are acting like a desperate, cornered thug." Richard's face flushed a deeper, more violent shade of crimson. He took another step toward me, his heavy breathing audible in the tense silence of the room. "I will do whatever it takes to protect my legacy." He spat, his eyes wild with desperate fury. "Hand over your phone, Rachel. Give me the password to David's encrypted hard drive right now, or I swear I will force it out of you." I let out a soft, echoing laugh that made Catherine flinch on the sofa. "You still do not understand the timeline," I stated, shaking my head with deep, profound pity. "You are standing there threatening physical violence to stop me from delivering the evidence to the authorities. You think I'm trying to escape this house to go alert the government." I leaned forward in the leather armchair, locking my eyes onto his panicked, furious face. At exactly 10:30 this morning, while you were all sitting in this room, eagerly waiting for me to arrive so you could spring your pathetic legal trap. My personal cell phone rang. Jamal suddenly snapped his head up, his dark eyes focusing on me with renewed, horrified attention. The corporate defense attorney instantly recognized the shift in my narrative. He knew I was about to drop the final, most devastating piece of the puzzle. I received a call from an unknown, out-of-state number. I continued, my voice perfectly steady and commanding. The man on the other end of the line was speaking incredibly fast. He sounded completely terrified. He told me that Vanguard Logistics had been locked down by federal agents. He told me that no one was going in and absolutely no one was coming out. Vanessa let out a small, confused whimper from the love seat, her tear-streaked face twisting as she tried to follow my words. "So someone warned you," she sobbed, her voice hoarse and broken. "An employee called to tip you off." I did not look at my sister. I kept my gaze firmly fixed on Richard and Jamal, ensuring they absorbed the absolute totality of their destruction. "It was not a random employee, Vanessa," I corrected sharply. "And it was not a friendly tip-off from a panicked coworker trying to do me a favor. You see, Vanguard Logistics employs over 4,000 people. When a federal raid of that magnitude occurs, cellular networks are jammed, communications are strictly monitored, and employees are instantly separated from their devices by armed tactical teams. A random shipping manager does not simply pull out his personal phone and casually dial the direct line of the senior forensic auditor while the lobby is being breached." Richard's fist slowly unclenched. The aggressive, violent posture he had adopted to block the door began to falter. He took a hesitant half-step backward, his mind struggling to grasp the terrifying implication of my words. "Then who called you?" Richard demanded, his voice dropping into a hoarse, shaky whisper. I smiled, feeling the ultimate weight of my long, grueling 14-month operation finally culminating into this exact perfect second. "The man who called me at 10:30 this morning was not an employee of Vanguard Logistics." I declared, every single syllable ringing with absolute crushing finality. "He was a federal agent calling from a highly secure line in Washington." Jamal let out a sharp, suffocated gasp, grabbing the edge of the glass coffee table with both hands to keep himself from collapsing completely onto the floor. "He did not call to warn me about the raid," I explained, leaning back comfortably into the leather armchair. "He called to confirm that the operation was officially a go. He called to tell me that the arrest warrants had been successfully signed by a federal judge and that the tactical teams were moving in to secure the corporate servers exactly as we had planned." I let the silence hang for 3 long, agonizing seconds, watching the absolute devastation wash over my family's faces as the inescapable truth finally crushed them. "That phone call was not a warning, Richard," I stated, delivering the final inescapable blow. "It was a status update. The man on the other end of that line was my handler." The word handler hung in the air of the grand living room, a heavy, suffocating weight that instantly crushed whatever delusional hope my family still harbored. Jamal stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of the silk sofa. He collapsed next to his weeping wife, his hands gripping his meticulously groomed hair. As a corporate defense attorney, he knew exactly what that specific word meant in the context of a federal racketeering investigation. It meant the government did not just have digital logs or circumstantial evidence. It meant they had an inside operative. "I did not spend the last 14 months simply auditing the Vanguard Logistics supply chain," I stated, ensuring my voice carried the full, devastating weight of my actions. "I did not just stumble across your offshore shell companies and keep the data on a hard drive out of spite. When I realized the sheer breathtaking magnitude of your international money laundering syndicate, I did not confront you. I did not ask for a cut of the stolen millions. I walked directly into the regional field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and I handed them the entire blueprint of your criminal empire." Catherine let out a sharp, guttural wail, burying her face into her hands. Richard remained completely frozen by the door, his massive chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. The patriarch who had just threatened to lock me in a basement was now entirely paralyzed by the realization that he was standing in the same room as a sworn federal informant. For over a year, I have been an active, fully documented confidential informant for the United States Department of Justice. I continued leaning forward in the leather armchair to deliver the absolute truth. Every single time you invited me to a family dinner and mocked my modest lifestyle, I was documenting your assets. Every time you ordered me to sign off on a questionable quarterly report, I was handing those exact documents to a team of federal forensic accountants. While you were busy treating me like a disposable, pathetic scapegoat, I was actively, methodically building the exact federal cage you are all about to spend the rest of your natural lives living inside. Vanessa lifted her tear-streaked face from the cushions, her eyes wide with a mixture of profound horror and desperate, lingering denial. You wore a wire, she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. You came into our homes and you recorded us. I smiled a cold, razor-sharp smile. I did not need to wear a wire, Vanessa. Your husband and our father were so blindingly arrogant that they freely documented their own felonies. But the Bureau did need someone on the inside to verify the operational structure. They needed someone who could map the exact hierarchy of the syndicate to ensure that when the indictments came down, they would hit the executive board and not just the low-level shipping managers. I was their compass. I guided the federal prosecutors straight through your maze of corporate deceit. I turned my gaze back to Jamal, who was staring at the glass coffee table as if it were a bomb about to detonate. The fraudulent confession and the fabricated IP logs were still sitting exactly where he had placed them. That is why I came here today, Jamal, I said, pointing a steady finger at the documents. I did not drive to this estate to beg for my life. I did not come here to be intimidated by your slick legal threats. My handler explicitly instructed me to let you present your fabricated evidence. The federal prosecutors already had enough to lock you away for the money laundering. But your pathetic attempt to frame an innocent auditor complete with forged digital signatures and spoofed network routing just handed them a beautiful airtight charge for obstruction of justice and conspiracy to commit perjury. You did not trap me today. You simply handed the government the final nail for your own coffin. Richard finally found his voice, though it was stripped of all its former booming authority. It sounded hollow, broken, and entirely defeated. You destroyed your own family, he whispered, staring at me with hollow eyes. You burned your own blood to the ground. You burned yourselves, I corrected him, my tone utterly merciless. You chose greed over your own daughter. You chose your luxury cars, your country club memberships, and your massive egos over my freedom. I simply handed the matches to the authorities and let them watch the fire. The heavy brass pendulum of the grandfather clock in the hallway swung with a deep, echoing chime. I did not need to look at the pristine white face to know the exact time. The rhythmic, mechanical striking confirmed what I already knew. It was exactly 12 o'clock in the afternoon, high noon. Right on cue, the suffocating silence of the Lake Forest estate was violently shattered. It started as a distant, high-pitched wail, rapidly multiplying into a deafening chorus of overlapping sirens echoing across the wealthy suburban neighborhood. The pristine tranquility of the exclusive enclave was instantly obliterated. The sound grew exponentially louder, tearing through the ancient oak trees and bouncing off the stone facade of the mansion. Then came the screeching of heavy tires. Multiple large, heavy vehicles aggressively tore onto the perfectly manicured gravel of the long, winding driveway. The deafening crunch of stone and the roar of high-performance engines vibrated through the floorboards of the grand living room. Catherine screamed a raw, piercing sound of absolute terror as intense bursts of flashing red and blue strobe lights suddenly pierced through the massive 12-foot windows. The aggressive, rapid-fire strobes bounced violently off the imported Persian rugs, fractured through the crystal chandelier, and painted the terrified faces of my family in alternating shades of stark, unavoidable justice. Outside, the chaotic symphony of a massive federal raid erupted. Heavy car doors slammed shut with violent metallic thuds. Aggressive, commanding voices shouted clear tactical orders over the blaring sirens, completely overwhelming the peaceful quiet of the estate. The heavy, synchronized stomping of dozens of combat boots rushed up the front walkway, shaking the very foundation of the multi-million-dollar fortress my father had built with stolen money. "They are here," I said softly, remaining perfectly seated in the leather armchair as the overwhelming force of the United States government descended upon my family. Vanessa curled into the tight ball on the sofa, sobbing hysterically as the reality of her shattered life finally crushed her. Jamal squeezed his eyes shut, bowing his head in total absolute defeat. Richard took a staggering step backward from the door, his hands trembling violently at his sides, completely powerless to stop the incoming tide. The grand, impenetrable walls of their fraudulent empire had finally been breached, and there was absolutely nowhere left for them to hide. The reinforced, solid oak front doors did not simply swing open, they were violently, explosively breached. A heavy steel battering ram smashed through the center panels with a deafening crack that tore the expensive wood straight off its custom hinges. The doors slammed inward, colliding with the marble walls of the foyer with force that sent framed photographs and expensive artwork crashing to the floor. A flood of tactical gear poured into the pristine house. Dozens of federal agents wearing dark body armor and helmets swarmed the entryway, their heavy boots trampling mercilessly over the imported silk rugs. Assault rifles were raised, and laser sights swept across the grand living room. "Federal Bureau of Investigation. Get down on the ground right now. Show me your hands." The booming, amplified voice of the lead tactical agent shattered the remaining air in the room. Richard, completely blinded by decades of unchecked power and towering hubris, actually tried to argue. He stood up straight, his face purple with rage, and raised a hand as if he were about to fire an insubordinate warehouse manager. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Richard bellowed, taking a step toward the armed agents. "I demand to speak to whoever is in charge of this ridiculous stunt." The agents did not care about his corporate titles. Two heavily armored men closed the distance in a fraction of a second. They grabbed Richard by his cashmere sweater, kicked his legs out from under him, and slammed the billionaire patriarch face first onto the floor. The sickening thud of his chin, hitting the glass coffee table, echoed sharply, sending Jamal's fabricated evidence scattering into the air. Catherine let out a piercing guttural shriek as an agent grabbed her shoulders and forced her down. She thrashed wildly, her expensive pearl necklace snapping and scattering tiny white beads across the hardwood floor. "Please, I am a respected member of this community," she wailed, her flawless makeup smearing as her cheek was pressed against the cold floorboards. "Do not put those on me." But the sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs ratcheting tight around her wrists was the only answer she received. Jamal knew exactly how federal raids operated. The arrogant defense attorney offered zero resistance. He dropped to his knees, placed his hands behind his head, and stared blankly at the wall as agents secured his wrists. Beside him, Vanessa kicked and screamed like a feral animal, begging the agents to let her go to her children, entirely ignoring the fact that she was the one who had jeopardized their future to fund her designer lifestyle. I remained perfectly still in the leather armchair. I kept my hands visible, resting calmly on my knees, watching the empire burn exactly as I had orchestrated. An agent approached me, checking my face against a photograph on his tactical monitor. He gave me a sharp, respectful nod and stepped back, leaving me completely untouched. They hauled my family to their feet. Richard had a line of blood dripping from his lip. Catherine was sobbing uncontrollably, her designer dress wrinkled and stained. Vanessa was hyperventilating, her mascara running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. Jamal looked like a walking corpse. "Move them out," the lead agent commanded. They were marched out of the grand living room, down the long corridor, and out the shattered front doors. I stood up from the armchair and followed at a slow, deliberate distance, wanting to witness the absolute totality of their downfall. The scene outside on the manicured gravel driveway was a picture of perfect, devastating humiliation. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles illuminated the sprawling estate. But it was not just the agents waiting for them. The commotion had drawn out the neighbors. The extremely wealthy, highly judgmental elites of the Lake Forest Country Club circle were standing at the edges of their pristine lawns. Men in golf polos and women in tennis skirts stood frozen holding up their smartphones, capturing every single humiliating second of the Vanguard Logistics Syndicate being paraded out in handcuffs. Catherine saw the cameras. She tried to turn her face away, weeping hysterically, begging the agents to cover her head. Richard stared straight down at the gravel, entirely stripped of his pride, his massive ego completely crushed under the collective judging stares of his peers. The social standing they had sacrificed me to protect was officially dead. They were outcasts, branded as federal criminals on live streams that were already flooding the internet. As the agents began loading them into the back of the armored transport vehicles, a tall man wearing a dark federal windbreaker stepped through the shattered front doors and walked back into the foyer where I was standing. He pulled off his tactical helmet and ran a hand through his damp, messy hair. It was David. My quiet, unassuming neighbor did not look terrified anymore. The frantic, sweating man who had pounded on my door at 4 a.m. was completely gone. He stood tall, projecting a calm, lethal authority that he had masterfully kept hidden for 14 months. David walked out onto the front porch, stopping right next to the transport vehicle where Jamal was being loaded. Jamal looked up, his dark eyes locking onto the mid-level cybersecurity contractor he had arrogantly dismissed. David reached into his windbreaker and casually pulled out a gold federal badge, letting it catch the midday sun. Supervisory Special Agent David Hayes, Federal Bureau of Investigation. David stated, his voice smooth and steady. He offered Jamal a cold, victorious smile. That panic attack in the hallway this morning was my finest acting work to date. I had to make sure Rachel kept her router offline so your little frame job would fall apart. You are a terrible network architect, Jamal. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you start using it. Jamal closed his eyes, the final realization of his total defeat washing over him as the heavy metal door of the transport vehicle slammed shut. I stepped out onto the porch, walking past the shattered remnants of the solid oak doors. Catherine was secured in the vehicle next to Jamal. She pressed her face against the reinforced glass, screaming my name, her face twisted in a mask of absolute hatred and desperate, pathetic pleading. I did not stop. I did not wave. I did not give her a single ounce of my energy. I simply walked right past her, treating her exactly the way she had treated me my entire life, like she did not exist. I walked down the stone steps and stepped onto the gravel driveway. The massive federal convoy began to pull out of the estate, their sirens blaring as they carried my toxic past away to a federal holding facility. I stood alone in the center of the driveway. I tilted my head back and looked up at the sky. The heavy, suffocating clouds of the morning had broken, making way for brilliant, piercing sunshine. I closed my eyes and took a deep, grounding breath of the crisp, freezing noon air. It filled my lungs with a pure, intoxicating lightness. There were no more lies to navigate. There were no more manipulative traps to avoid. There were no more expectations to fail. I had walked into the lion's den completely surrounded by predators, and I had emerged as the only one left standing. I opened my eyes, looking at my reliable, practical sedan parked near the edge of the fountain. I pulled my car keys from my coat pocket. I was completely free. I was victorious. And for the first time in 33 years, I was finally ready to start my real life. Rachel's triumph over her toxic family teaches a profound lesson about self-worth and unwavering boundaries. For decades, her relatives minimized her existence, ultimately treating her as a disposable scapegoat to hide their massive corporate fraud. Yet Rachel proved that your value is never defined by those who intentionally refuse to see it. Instead of surrendering to their cruel manipulation, she quietly gathered her strength, trusted her intellect, and fought for her absolute freedom. We must learn to aggressively protect our own peace rather than begging for respect where it simply does not exist. Take charge of your own narrative and stand up for your worth today. Have you ever had to set firm boundaries with toxic relatives to protect your peace? Comment below.